I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet escape, nothing more than a break from my routine. I wanted to spend a week away from everything, away from the noise, away from people, and away from the pressure that always seemed to build when I stayed too long in one place. The idea of being surrounded by trees, a lake not far away, and no phone signal felt like peace to me. The cabin itself was simple. Wood walls, small kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom with running water pulled from a well nearby. There was a wood stove for heat and a small generator that I could run if I needed extra power. I had packed food that would last me the week, some tools, a flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a couple of books. Everything seemed normal at first. The first night was quiet. I ate a simple meal, read for a while, and went to bed early. The only sounds came from the wind in the trees and the faint creaks of the cabin settling. I fell asleep easily. The next morning, I woke up feeling rested. I cooked eggs on the small propane stove and made coffee. The air outside was cold but clean. It felt good to be away from people. By the second day, I had started exploring the woods around the cabin. There was a path that ran down to the lake about a 10-minute walk away, and another trail that went deeper into the forest. The deeper trail was rough, overgrown in places, and felt less traveled. I followed it for a while, marking spots in my head to remember the way back. After an hour, I turned around, not wanting to push too far without a better sense of the land. When I returned to the cabin, everything seemed fine. But that evening, something small caught my attention. I had left my axe leaning against the woodpile beside the cabin. When I went out to bring in more wood for the stove, the axe was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had misplaced it, maybe leaned it somewhere else. I checked around the cabin, looked near the porch, checked by the shed out back. It wasn't there. Eventually, I found it stuck into a tree about 30 feet from the cabin. It was buried deep into the bark, as if someone had swung it hard. I stood there staring at it for a long time. My first thought was that I had done it myself and forgotten. Maybe when I came back from the trail, I had swung it at the tree for no reason, just to let off energy, and then forgot about it. But I didn't remember doing that, and the way it was stuck so firmly in the tree didn't feel like something I would have done casually. I pulled it out, brought it back, and set it inside the cabin. That night, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. The woods outside felt darker than the night before. I kept thinking about the axe. On the third day, I tried to shake the feeling. I told myself I was overthinking, that I had probably been careless. I went down to the lake in the morning, sat by the water for a while, and skipped stones across the surface. The air was quiet, but I noticed how still the woods seemed. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. It was unusual, but I ignored it. When I came back, I saw footprints near the cabin. They were clear in the soft dirt, larger than mine, and led from the edge of the trees to the back of the cabin. My stomach tightened when I saw them. I bent down, studying them closely. The steps were deep, spaced further apart than my own. Whoever made them had walked right up to the back wall of the cabin and then turned back toward the trees. I stayed outside for a while, scanning the woods, trying to see if anyone was there. But the trees were thick, the shadows deep, and I couldn't see far. I told myself it might have been hunters passing by. Maybe they had been curious about the cabin and then left. But that didn't explain why they came so close without knocking or leaving a note. That night, I couldn't relax. Every sound felt sharp, every creak of the cabin louder than it should have been. I kept the axe next to the bed. I barely slept. On the fourth day, I woke up feeling heavy from lack of rest. I stepped outside, and my stomach dropped. The woodpile had been knocked over. Logs were scattered across the ground, some split pieces thrown several feet away. It didn't look like an animal. It looked like someone had kicked at it, maybe even picked up pieces and tossed them around. I spent the morning cleaning it up, stacking the wood again, but my mind kept circling back to the same thought. Someone was messing with me. Someone knew I was here alone. I checked the trail that went deeper into the forest, wondering if I would see any sign of someone else. About a half-mile in, I found cigarette butts crushed into the dirt. They were fresh, the filters white, not yellowed with time. Whoever had been there recently. When I turned back, I kept feeling like I was being watched. My neck prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Back at the cabin, I stayed inside with the windows closed. I ate only a little food that evening and sat in silence, listening. That night was worse. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, steady, circling the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there in the dark, not daring to move. The steps crunched on the dirt and leaves, moved around to the back, then around to the porch. I heard the boards creak under weight. Someone was standing just outside the door. The doorknob rattled once, then stopped. Silence followed, long and heavy. After several minutes, I heard the steps again, moving away, fading into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the axe, every muscle in my body tight. By the fifth day, I was exhausted, jumpy, and unsure of what to do. There was no cell signal. The nearest town was miles away, and I had walked in deep enough that I wasn't sure I could make it quickly if I left on foot. I thought about starting the generator to make noise, to feel less alone, but I worried it would just announce that I was there. In the afternoon, I went outside to check around. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a branch near the edge of the woods was a piece of cloth. It looked torn, frayed at the edges, and tied to the branch in a knot. Beneath it, carved into the dirt with a stick or a boot heel, was a circle. Just a simple circle. I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't natural. Someone had done it, and they had done it within sight of the cabin. I backed away, went inside, and locked the door. That night was the worst yet. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to a sound like scratching on the wall. It started slow, a dragging sound against the wood. Then it moved, circling the cabin, scratching here and there. I didn't breathe. I sat in bed, axe in hand, waiting for something to break, for the door to splinter, for a window to shatter. But nothing happened. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully. On the wall of the cabin, just beside the door, someone had carved a line into the wood. It wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. A straight vertical line, nothing else. I didn't know what to do anymore. Leaving felt dangerous, staying felt worse. My food was still enough for a couple of days, but I couldn't imagine another night there. On the 6th day, I made my decision. I packed what I could carry, slung my bag over my shoulder, and set out on the trail toward the road. I didn't care how long it took. I just wanted to get out. The woods were silent as I moved, every crack of a branch under my boots too loud. I kept glancing behind me, certain I would see someone following. After an hour, I heard movement off the trail. Heavy steps, branches breaking. Whoever it was, they weren't far. It quickened my pace, almost running. The sound followed, sometimes closer, sometimes further. I didn't stop. After what felt like forever, I saw the outline of the road ahead. Relief rushed through me, but it was cut short when I heard a whistle. A short, sharp whistle, coming from the woods behind me. I didn't look back. I ran out onto the road, heart hammering, lungs burning. The road was empty, stretching in both directions, but I kept moving, forcing my legs to carry me forward. It took me nearly 3 hours before I reached a small gas station. I must have looked insane, covered in sweat and dirt, stumbling inside with wide eyes. The clerk stared at me as I grabbed the counter to steady myself. I never told him the details. I just asked for a phone and called for a ride. When I finally got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. The cabin stayed in my mind for weeks. The sound of footsteps, the scratching on the walls, the footprints, the carved line. None of it made sense. Whoever was out there never showed themselves, never said a word, never tried to break in. They only wanted me to know they were there, and that was worse than anything else. I never went back. I didn't plan for things to turn out the way they did. My trip to the cabin was supposed to be quiet, simple, and uneventful, just a chance to get away from the constant buzz of daily life. I had been working long weeks back to back, barely catching up on sleep, and the idea of spending some time in isolation sounded like the perfect way to reset. The cabin was small, nothing fancy, but it sat tucked deep into the woods, far away from traffic, sirens, and city noise. The kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat if you stayed still long enough. The drive there took several hours, most of it along a 2-lane road that twisted through hills and forests. Once I left the last gas station behind, I realized there wasn't much else between me and the cabin but thick woods and empty stretches of asphalt. My phone had already lost service, and I knew it would stay that way until I was back near town. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow, rough, and seemed like it hadn't been used much lately. Branches reached out from the trees and scraped along the side of my truck as I drove in. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt that little sense of relief that always comes with arriving somewhere new. The cabin was simple, with a slanted metal roof, a small porch, and wood stacked neatly by the side. The clearing around it was barely large enough to let in sunlight, and beyond that, the woods pressed close on all sides. I carried in my supplies, mostly canned food, water jugs, and a cooler I had filled earlier. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a few lanterns, and an old hand pump outside for water. The inside smelled faintly of cedar and ash, like fires long gone cold. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the beams of light coming in through the windows. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. The first few hours passed easily enough. I stacked wood near the stove, checked the lanterns, and made sure the door locked properly. It did, though the metal latch was a little bent. After unpacking, I sat on the porch for a while and listened to the wind push through the trees. The air smelled clean and sharp, and the quiet was almost heavy. By evening, the forest around the cabin had gone dark in a way that city nights never do. There were no distant car headlights, no glow from street lamps, no background hum. Just black trees and a thin slice of moon overhead. I lit a lantern inside and made myself a simple meal from a can. It was plain, but it filled me up. The first night was uneventful, though I did notice how every sound carried differently out there. The creaks of the cabin seemed louder. The groan of branches bending in the wind sounded like something closer. Around midnight, I thought I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. A faint scuff like wood against wood. I froze in bed, waiting, but it didn't come again. I told myself it was just a branch shifting. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee mug in hand and noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, not far from the tree line, there were tracks in the dirt. At first, I thought they might be from a deer, but the shape was wrong. They looked more like boot prints, heavy ones. I crouched down and studied them, realizing they were fresh. The edges of the prints were sharp, not softened by rain or wind. I hadn't walked that way, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the road coming in. It unsettled me, but I brushed it off. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone had walked by before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. I tried not to overthink it. Still, I found myself glancing back at the tree line more often as I went about my morning. Throughout the day, I busied myself with chores. I chopped wood, cleared some brush, and walked a short way into the woods to get a feel for the area. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth in places and tall pines standing close together. It was easy to lose your bearings after just a few turns. That thought made me careful not to go far without marking my path. By late afternoon, I decided to try some fishing at a small stream I had seen on the drive-in. I followed the gravel road back until I found the narrow trail leading down to it. The water was clear and cold, running quickly over rocks, and I spent an hour or two there, catching nothing but enjoying the peace. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was already dropping low. I stepped into the clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. The door to the cabin was wide open. I had locked it when I left. I was certain of it. My chest tightened as I stood there, staring at the dark gap where the door should be closed. The woods were silent around me, too silent. No birds, no insects, just the faint rush of my own blood in my ears. I forced myself to move, one step at a time, toward the porch. My boots crunched softly on the dirt. When I reached the door, I pushed it open slowly and peered inside. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. My bag was still by the bed, the lantern still on the table. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and checked each corner. Everything was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I locked the door again, checking the latch twice this time. Then I walked slowly around the cabin, looking for signs. On the far side, near one of the windows, I found them. More prints, boots, and closer this time, pressed right up against the wall. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak set me on edge. Every brush of wind against the cabin felt like footsteps outside. I sat up in bed for hours, lantern turned low, just listening. By morning, exhaustion had dulled the sharp edge of fear, but not the unease. I walked the clearing again, searching for more tracks. They were harder to see in daylight, but I spotted a faint trail leading into the woods. Whoever had been there had stood close, maybe even watched me. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but a stubborn part of me resisted. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd driven all this way for peace and quiet, and I wasn't going to scare myself into leaving early. But I couldn't relax. That evening, I built a fire outside and sat near it, telling myself it was for warmth, though really it was to keep the darkness pushed back. I kept the lantern close when I went inside, and I propped a chair under the door latch. It wasn't much, but it felt like something. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound. Not the wind, not the trees. It was a slow, deliberate step on the porch, wood creaking under weight. I held my breath. Another step, and then the faint sound of the latch being tested. Metal rattling softly. I stayed frozen, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The chair under the latch held firm, and after a few long moments, the rattling stopped. Silence pressed in again, thick and suffocating. I didn't move until dawn. When I finally opened the door, the porch was empty, but the dirt just below it told the story clearly. Prints. Fresh, deep prints. Someone had stood there, trying to get in while I was just feet away on the other side. That was when I made my decision. I couldn't stay. This wasn't just nerves or imagination. Someone was out there, and they knew I was alone. I packed quickly, stuffing my things back into my bag with shaking hands. Every few minutes, I glanced toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching. I loaded my truck, started the engine, and didn't look back until the cabin was out of sight. On the drive back, my eyes flicked constantly to the mirrors, scanning the empty road behind me. My hands were tight on the wheel, knuckles pale. The woods seemed endless, hemming me in on both sides, and I didn't relax until I saw the first sign of town. Even then, I couldn't shake it. The prints, the door, the sound of footsteps in the night. Someone had been out there, moving closer each time, watching, waiting, and I had been completely alone. That cabin had seemed like the perfect escape, but in the end, it had left me with a kind of fear I couldn't easily explain. The kind that stayed with me long after I left, making every creak of my own house at night feel like a step on the porch, every shadow by the window feel like someone standing just outside. I never went back. I had been looking forward to a week alone in the cabin for months. The cabin belonged to a friend of my uncle, who let me stay there since it was empty most of the year. I wanted peace and quiet, far away from the noise of the city and the constant interruptions of people. The place was deep in the woods, down a narrow gravel road that felt like it went on forever. It was the kind of road where if your car broke down, you would be stuck walking for hours before reaching another house. I packed enough supplies for the week, mostly canned food, bottled water, some dry goods, a small cooler of meat, and a few basic tools. I had a small battery lantern, a flashlight, and my phone with a weak signal that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. When I first arrived, the cabin looked perfect. It wasn't large, just one floor with 2 small rooms and a little porch. The roof was metal and the walls were old wood that had gone dark from years of weather. There was a small fireplace inside, a table with 2 chairs, a single bed, and some shelves with old books and kitchen items left by the owner. I swept the floor, opened the small windows to air it out, and made myself comfortable. first, I enjoyed the silence. The only sounds were birds, wind moving through the trees, and the occasional creak of the old wood. The first day passed without any issue. I chopped some firewood, stacked it near the porch, and cooked a simple meal on the small stove that ran on propane. I read a book until dark and then sat outside on the porch steps, looking into the thick woods. The forest was dense. Once the sun went down, it was like a wall of black pressed against the edge of the cabin. The night was colder than I expected, and I went inside early, locking the door and sliding the bolt. I wasn't scared then, only aware of how isolated I was. The first night, I slept fine. I woke up once or twice, hearing the sound of branches cracking outside, but I told myself it was probably deer or raccoons. On the second day, I noticed something strange. When I went out in the morning to bring in more wood, I saw footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. At first, I thought maybe they were mine from the day before, but they were larger. I wear size 10 shoes, and these prints were definitely bigger. The soil was soft, so the prints were clear. They weren't boot prints like a hiker's, more like work boots or heavy outdoor shoes. I felt uneasy, but I told myself maybe the owner had been here recently. Still, the prints looked fresh, like they were made the night before. I shook it off and spent the day fishing at the small stream about half a mile away. I caught 2 small trout and carried them back to the cabin, cooked them with some rice, and felt better about things. But that night, I heard something again. It was around midnight when I woke up to the sound of slow footsteps outside. The porch creaked once, and then it went quiet. I held my breath, waiting. The old wood of the porch made sound even under my own weight, so I knew I hadn't imagined it. I stayed still for an hour, my ears straining for every small sound, until eventually I fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing seemed disturbed, but when I walked around the cabin, I found more prints circling around the back. They weren't animal tracks. They were definitely human. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. I hadn't seen a single other person since I arrived, and this place wasn't near any hiking trails. Whoever it was had to come here on purpose. I spent most of the day inside, keeping the windows open just enough to hear what was happening outside. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the small glass panes, expecting to see a shadow pass by. As the sun dropped, I decided to stay awake as long as I could. I kept the lantern low, sat near the window, and waited. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time it was clearer. Slow, deliberate steps on the dry leaves just outside. My chest pounded so hard I thought the sound alone would give me away. I leaned toward the window but saw nothing but black trees. Then the porch creaked again, and I knew for sure someone was out there. The steps stopped directly in front of the door. I sat frozen, staring at the wooden door as if I could see through it. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved again, this time circling the cabin slowly. Leaves crunched under heavy boots, moving around the walls. I didn't dare move until the sounds faded into the woods. When daylight came, I checked outside again. More prints circling the cabin. I noticed something else this time. A cigarette, but near the edge of the porch, still fairly fresh. I don't smoke, and I hadn't seen one before. Whoever was out there had been close enough to leave it behind. I thought about leaving right then, packing my bag and driving away. But the problem was that I had come down a long gravel road, and my car was parked in front of the cabin, exposed. If the person was still out there in the woods, they could easily watch me leave. The thought of being caught halfway down that lonely road if my car stalled, or if they blocked it, scared me even more. I decided to wait to see if maybe it was just some hunter passing by. That day, I tried to act normal. I chopped more wood, kept busy, and pretended to myself that I wasn't afraid. But as night came, dread filled me. I bolted the door again, kept the lantern off, and sat in the dark. I had my small hatchet in my hand and the flashlight ready. Sure enough, the sounds returned. Footsteps, this time closer, bolder. The porch groaned under the weight. Then I heard the sound that froze me completely. The doorknob rattled. Someone tried it slowly, gently, as if testing to see if it was unlocked. My throat went dry. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand ached. The knob twisted once, twice, then stopped. After a long silence, the footsteps moved again, circling, and then fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I made the decision to leave. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag quickly, throwing food and clothes together, and loaded the car. Before starting it, I stood still, listening. The woods were silent. I started the engine and drove slowly down the gravel road, my eyes scanning the trees on both sides. Every shadow looked like a person watching. When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, near a gas station. I sat in the car for a long time, breathing hard, feeling how close everything had been. I never went back to that cabin again. Later, when I told my uncle what happened, he said the owner had mentioned before that people sometimes trespass there, but I knew it wasn't just random trespassing. Someone had been watching me, circling the cabin night after night, waiting for something. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't kept the door locked, but I know for certain that staying another night would have been a mistake. Even now, when I think about those nights, I can still hear the sound of the porch creaking under heavy boots, and I remember the feeling of being trapped inside, knowing someone was just a few feet away on the other side of the door. I came to the cabin because I thought I needed time away from everything. I had been working long hours for months, not sleeping well, and I felt like I was slowly breaking down from stress. A friend of mine mentioned that his uncle owned an old hunting cabin in the mountains that no one really used anymore, and he said I could stay there for a week if I wanted peace and quiet. At first, I thought it sounded like a good idea. Somewhere far from the city, away from the noise and lights, just me and the woods. I pictured fresh air, the sound of birds, maybe even long walks on the trails. I imagined it as something almost healing. The drive up there was long. I left early in the morning and headed north. At first, the roads were normal highways, crowded with trucks and cars. But the farther I went, the quieter it got. By noon, I was driving on two-lane roads that twisted through forest and hills, barely seeing another car for miles. The sky was gray, the kind of dull overcast that doesn't move much. It felt heavy, like a lid over the world. I had directions written on a piece of paper, since cell service would cut out. After hours of turning down smaller and smaller roads, I finally reached the last one, which was gravel, narrow, and barely maintained. The road led downhill into a valley. I could see mountains on all sides, their slopes thick with trees. The gravel road was bumpy and full of ruts. I had to drive slow. When I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved. It looked old but sturdy. A rectangle of dark wood, small windows, a pitched roof with a chimney. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and bare patches of rock. A stream ran nearby, though it was low this time of year, just a trickle of water. There was no sign of anyone else. No other cabins, no roads, nothing. I parked near the porch and got out. The air smelled sharp, like pine needles and damp earth. It was completely quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. I carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. The furniture was basic. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small couch, shelves with old mugs and plates, and a single bed against the wall. There was no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and a lantern for light. I spent the first hour settling in. I put my food in a cooler with ice I had brought, stacked some wood inside, and checked the windows and door locks. They worked, though the wood was old. Then I sat outside on the porch for a while. The silence made me uneasy, but I told myself I'd get used to it. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the stove, cooked some canned food, and sat reading a book by lantern light. When I turned the lantern off, the darkness was complete. No streetlights, no glow from nearby houses, just blackness pressing against the windows. I could hear the stream faintly and the occasional crack of a branch in the woods. I lay in bed listening until I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The second day, I decided to walk around the area. There was no marked trail, but I followed the stream for a while, then climbed partway up the slope of the valley. The ground was uneven and covered with fallen branches. I could see the cabin below me when I stopped to rest. It looked even smaller from above, like a toy house dropped in the middle of endless trees. That afternoon, while sitting on the porch, I noticed something odd, a broken branch near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought an animal had done it, but when I walked over, I saw the ground had footprints. Not boot prints exactly, but shoes, human shoes. They were faint, like the soil had dried and filled them partly in, but they were there. Someone had walked along the edge of the clearing, maybe days before. I stared at them for a long time. The idea that someone else had been here unsettled me, but I told myself it wasn't strange. Hunters, hikers, anyone could have wandered through. That night, though, I found it harder to relax. I kept thinking about those prints. I listened more closely to sounds outside. The stove popped and hissed. The wind moved through the trees. At one point, I thought I heard something faint, like a footstep on the porch, but when I held my breath, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just the old wood settling in the cool night. On the third day, I woke early, restless. The cabin felt smaller, the silence heavier. I went outside, walked along the stream, then sat on a rock near the clearing. The whole time, I had a strange sense of being watched. It made my skin crawl. I looked into the trees, but saw nothing. When I came back, I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the porch railing, near the corner, there was a mark. A line scratched into the wood. Not deep, but fresh. I was certain it hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been made with a knife or some sharp object. Just one line, about 6 inches long. I stood there staring at it, my stomach tight. The rest of that day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some wood, made food, tried to read. But my eyes kept drifting to the windows, scanning the tree line. The silence was no longer calming. It was threatening. That night was worse. Couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. Around midnight, I heard something. Not the usual creaks of wood, not the wind. It was outside, a faint crunch like footsteps on dirt. I held my breath, every muscle rigid. The sound moved slowly, stopping, starting again. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't move. After what felt like forever, the sound faded away. By the fourth morning, I was jumpy, exhausted. I decided to leave early, but when I checked my car, I froze. One of the tires was flat, a clean slash in the rubber, not just a puncture. I stood there staring, my throat dry. That meant someone had come during the night. Someone had cut it on purpose. Panic hit me hard. I thought about hiking back to the main road, but it was miles away, through thick forest with no guarantee I'd even find it. I had food, water, and the cabin, but now the cabin felt like a trap. I spent the day moving in short bursts, checking the woods, locking and unlocking the door, peering out windows. Couldn't relax. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there. That night, I barely let the lantern go out. I sat in the chair with the wood stove burning low, staring at the door. Hours passed. At some point, I heard it again. Slow footsteps in the clearing. This time closer. My throat closed. My skin crawled. The steps circled the cabin, crunching softly in the dirt and pine needles. At one point, something brushed against the wall outside, making a dull scrape. I gripped the poker from the stove and waited. The steps moved away eventually, fading into silence. I didn't sleep at all. The fifth day, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag, loaded it with food and water, and prepared to hike out. I figured if I followed the stream downhill, it might lead me to a road eventually. I left mid-morning, moving fast. Every sound in the woods made me spin around, expecting someone behind me. After hours of walking, I realized how dense the forest was. The stream twisted endlessly, and the valley seemed deeper than I thought. I kept going until late afternoon, but I never found a road. By evening, I was exhausted and terrified of being caught out in the dark. I turned back, forcing myself to retrace my path. When I finally saw the cabin again, I felt no relief, only dread. The clearing looked wrong, the cabin darker, like it had been waiting for me. I slept little that night, hearing things outside again. At one point, there was a sound at the window, like fingers dragging lightly across the glass. I lay frozen, clutching the stove poker, barely breathing. On the sixth morning, I saw new footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Clear, fresh. They circled the building, stopping at each window, then at the door. I knew then I wasn't imagining any of it. Someone had been out there, walking slowly around while I lay inside, watching, testing the locks. I stayed inside all day, too afraid to leave. I rationed my food, tried to stay calm, but my hands shook constantly. I thought about trying to fix the tire, but it was slashed too deeply. I had no spare. That night, everything escalated. The footsteps came again, earlier this time, just after dark. Slow, deliberate circling. Then a sound at the porch, boards creaking under weight. I stared at the door, my chest so tight I couldn't breathe. The handle rattled softly, just once, then again. Whoever it was, they were testing it gently, carefully. I gripped the poker until my hands ached. The rattling stopped. Silence. I thought maybe they had gone. Then I heard scraping again at the side window, like something sharp dragged across the glass. I stayed motionless, barely blinking. The scraping stopped. Silence again. Hours passed before I dared move. By the seventh morning, I was falling apart. I rented the cabin because I thought I needed time alone, away from the noise of the city and away from people for a while. It sat deep in the woods, about 40 minutes from the nearest small town, with only a narrow dirt road winding its way up to it. The place looked simple from the outside, made of old logs that had darkened from years of weather, with a tin roof and a single brick chimney. It seemed calm when I first arrived, the kind of calm that almost feels heavy, like the silence itself is pressing down on you. I unloaded my bags, stacked the small cooler inside, and settled in, not thinking much beyond the plan of spending a few quiet days reading, writing, and maybe hiking a little. The cabin had no neighbors within sight. It was surrounded on all sides by thick trees, mostly pines. Their branches clumped together so close that the forest floor looked darker even in daylight. The only open space was the clearing the cabin sat in, where the grass grew thin and patchy and the soil looked worn down by years of vehicles coming in and out. Beyond that, everything was dense woods with no clear trail unless you forced your way through. Inside, the place had only the basics. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchenette with a counter and old cabinets, a bathroom tucked behind a narrow door, and a loft above with a mattress pushed up under the slanted roof. The furniture was old but sturdy. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a sagging couch, and a couple shelves with some left-behind books. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, not even reliable cell service. Just quiet. At first, it felt almost refreshing. I chopped some kindling, started a fire in the stove to keep the place warm, and made a simple meal. The first night, I sat by the stove listening to the crackle of the wood as the room filled with that dry heat you only get from burning logs. When I climbed into the loft to sleep, I remember thinking how peaceful it all seemed, how the silence felt almost like it was wrapping me up. But the second night, things began to feel different. It wasn't one big event at first, just little things that unsettled me. I heard a faint crunch of leaves outside while I was lying in bed. At first, I thought it was an animal. This was the woods after all, and animals moved around at night. But the sound wasn't random. It wasn't like the quick scurrying of a rabbit or the heavy steps of a deer. It sounded spaced out, steady, almost like footsteps. I held still in the loft, staring at the ceiling beams, waiting for it to fade. After a while, it did. The next morning, I walked outside, trying to tell myself I just imagined it, but I noticed something in the dirt of the clearing. It looked like a partial boot print, pressed into the soft ground near the edge of the tree line. It wasn't fresh enough to be sharp, but it didn't look old either. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to decide if maybe it was mine from the day before, though I had only stepped around near my car and up the porch steps. This one looked farther out. I told myself it didn't matter. People sometimes wandered through woods. Maybe a hunter had passed by. That day I tried to focus on reading, but the quiet started to feel heavier. I noticed how every creak of the cabin floor made me glance toward the door, and how the woods outside seemed too still at times, like they were holding their breath. By evening, when I went out to bring in more firewood, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder at the tree line. The third night was worse. The sound came again later than before. This time, it was closer, circling faintly around the cabin. The crunch of leaves would come, then stop, then come again in a different spot. I sat up in bed, my heart beating hard, straining to hear. The fire downstairs had burned down low, so the cabin was dim, only a faint orange glow seeping up from the stove. I didn't move, not at first, but when the sound seemed to pause right outside the cabin wall, just below where I was lying in the loft, I couldn't take it anymore. I climbed down quietly, careful not to make the floorboards groan, and grabbed the small flashlight I'd left on the table. My hand shook as I clicked it on, and I aimed the weak beam out the front window. Nothing, just the clearing and the dark line of trees. I checked the back window. Still nothing. Finally, I stood there, listening so hard my ears rang. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was an animal again, that I was being stupid, but the truth was I didn't believe that anymore. When morning came, I went out again, half afraid of what I might see. First, it looked normal, but when I walked the edge of the clearing, I found another mark in the dirt. This one wasn't just partial, it was clearer. It was a boot print facing the cabin. I felt sick when I saw it. Someone had been there. It wasn't my imagination, and the print was recent enough that I knew it hadn't been there long before I noticed it. I thought about leaving right then, throwing everything in the car and driving back to town. But part of me hesitated. I kept telling myself there might be a simple explanation, that maybe someone had been hunting or passing through and just came close out of curiosity. If they had wanted to do anything worse, they already would have. That was the line I kept feeding myself. Still, I couldn't relax. That whole day, I kept checking the windows, scanning the woods for movement. Every crack of a branch outside made me freeze. When night came again, I dreaded it. The fourth night, I barely slept at all. I sat in the chair by the stove with the fire burning low, gripping the flashlight in one hand and the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping kindling in the other. Hours dragged by with nothing happening. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Slow steps in the leaves, closer this time. They circled once, then stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the sound itself. I waited, my throat dry, my ears straining. Then, from the back of the cabin, a faint scrape. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through everything else. It sounded like metal against wood. I stood there, frozen. The only thing at the back of the cabin was the small window near the bathroom. I didn't want to check it, but I knew I had to. Moving as quietly as I could, I edged toward the back. The floor creaked under my weight, and I stopped, holding my breath. Then I aimed the flashlight at the window. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the beam on the glass. But when I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. There were smudges on the outside of the glass. Not just dirt, marks that looked like fingers, as if someone had pressed their hand there. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The rest of the night, I didn't move from the chair. I sat there until daylight came, my eyes burning, my body stiff. That morning, I made my choice. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving clothes and food back into bags without caring how they fit. I wanted out. Whatever this was, whoever it was, I wasn't staying to find out more. When I carried the first bag to the car, the air outside felt wrong. The woods were too quiet again, like even the birds didn't want to be there. When I reached the driver's side, I froze. There was something tucked under the wiper blade on my windshield. A piece of paper folded once. My chest felt tight as I pulled it out with shaking hands. The paper was blank. Just a torn scrap of lined notebook paper, folded and left there. I dropped it and climbed into the car, starting the engine fast. Gravel spun under the tires as I pulled out of the clearing. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to see if someone was standing at the edge of the woods watching me leave. I drove the twisting dirt road too fast, my eyes darting to the mirrors again and again. half expecting to see headlights behind me even though I knew no one was there. When I finally reached the paved road and kept going, only then did I start to breathe again, but it was shaky and shallow. By the time I reached the small town, the sun was high. I pulled into the first gas station and sat there for a while, hands gripping the wheel, trying to steady myself. I kept replaying it all in my head. The footsteps, the handprint, the folded paper. None of it made sense, but all of it felt deliberate. Someone had been there. Someone had circled that cabin at night, watching, waiting, getting closer each time. I never went back. I left the key in the drop box at the rental office and didn't ask for my deposit. I didn't care. The cabin was just wood and logs and a roof, but the memory of it stuck with me. Even now, I still wake some nights straining to hear past the silence, half expecting the crunch of footsteps just outside the wall. And I still see that folded piece of paper in my mind, blank, as if the message wasn't what was written on it, but the fact that it was left there at all. That was the worst part, the reminder that I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there, close enough to touch the glass, close enough to leave something on my car, close enough that if they had wanted to step inside, nothing would have stopped them. I drove for hours before I reached the cabin. It sat deep in the woods, farther than most people would care to go, and the road leading to it was nothing more than a dirt trail that had been beaten down by old truck tires over the years. The trees grew tall and thick on either side, making the daylight seem dimmer than it really was. I had rented the place for a week because I wanted quiet, nothing else. My head had been filled with too much noise from work, from people, from the city. I thought the silence of the woods would help me reset. When I finally parked and stepped out, I noticed how still it was. The kind of stillness that felt heavy, almost pressing down on me. The cabin itself was simple, built out of dark wood that looked older than it should have been. The roof sagged a little on one side, and the porch creaked when I stepped onto it. I pushed open the door and found the inside as plain as expected. A small kitchen, a main room with a stone fireplace, one bedroom in the back, and a bathroom barely big enough to stand in. It wasn't much, but it would do. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked what little I had brought, set up some food in the kitchen, and spent most of the afternoon walking the trails nearby. The forest stretched far in every direction, the ground soft with layers of pine needles. I didn't see a single person, which reassured me. The whole point was to be alone. At night, I sat by the fireplace, listening to the crack of wood as it burned. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls, and I could hear branches scraping against the roof. It was unsettling at first, but then I let it fade into background noise. The second night was when I noticed something. I had gone to bed around 11. The bed was small and rough, but I was tired enough not to care. At some point, I woke to the sound of gravel shifting outside. My truck was parked only a few feet from the porch, and the ground around it was covered in small stones. The sound was soft, like weight pressing down and grinding against them. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. I held my breath and listened, but after a few moments it stopped. I didn't get up to check. I told myself it was nothing. The next morning, though, I saw something that made me pause. In the dirt near the steps of the porch were shoe prints. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and pressed deeper into the ground. I stood there staring at them for a while, trying to reason it out. Maybe the owner of the cabin had come by to check on something, but I hadn't heard a car. There was no sign of another vehicle. The prints circled the porch and then stopped near the side window of the main room. That bothered me more than anything else. Someone had walked around, looking. I tried to brush it off. I told myself people sometimes wander, maybe hunters or hikers, even though I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I went about my day, but I couldn't stop glancing out the windows. The forest no longer felt as empty as before. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch had me looking over my shoulder. That night, I made sure to lock the doors and windows. The locks were old, not very strong, but they were all I had. I sat by the fire longer than usual, watching the flames until I felt my eyes growing heavy. Just as I was about to head to bed, I heard it again, the crunch of gravel. Slow, deliberate steps. My chest tightened as I froze in place, listening. The sound moved from the truck to the side of the cabin, then toward the back. I sat perfectly still, the firelight flickering against the walls. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the sound faded. The next morning, I went outside and found more prints. Clearer this time. Whoever it was had come right up to the back door. The handle had dirt smudges on it, as if someone had tried to turn it. My stomach sank. This wasn't random wandering. Someone had been trying to get in. I thought about leaving then, packing up and driving back to town. But something stubborn in me resisted. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe I was letting my imagination spin things out of control. I convinced myself to stay. I wish I hadn't. That day, I barely left the cabin. I kept the curtains drawn, only peeking out every now and then. The silence outside felt heavier than before. I didn't hear any birds. I didn't hear anything at all. When night came, I felt tense, sitting in the dark, listening. Hours passed without sound, until just after midnight when I heard it again. The footsteps, this time closer, slower, circling the cabin like before. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I moved to the bedroom and locked the door, though I knew it wouldn't matter much if someone decided to break in. I sat on the floor in the dark, every nerve in my body alive. Then came the sound that nearly broke me. The back door rattled. Not just the handle turning, but actual force against it. Someone was pushing, testing, trying to get in. The wood creaked under the strain. I held my breath, gripping a heavy flashlight in my hand as if it could protect me. After a few long minutes, the sound stopped. When morning came, I went outside shaking. The back door had marks on it, scratches where the wood had splintered. Whoever it was had used something to try and pry it open. I didn't know why they hadn't succeeded. Maybe the lock had held, maybe they gave up, maybe they were waiting. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my bag without care. I loaded the truck and turned the key, but the engine didn't start. I tried again and again, but it only clicked. My stomach dropped. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, though I knew nothing about fixing cars. Then I saw it, wires cut clean through. Someone had done it. Panic took over. My phone had no service this deep in the woods. I was stranded. I went back inside the cabin and locked the doors, my hands trembling. I had food and water, enough to last, but the thought of being trapped out here with someone circling the place made me feel sick. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of the main room with the fire out, not daring to make a light. Hours passed in silence until I heard it again. The footsteps, closer, slower. This time, there was no hesitation. The back door cracked and splintered as force hit it again and again. I knew it wouldn't hold. My only chance was the front door. I grabbed my bag and bolted. The night air was freezing against my skin, the gravel sharp under my shoes as I ran toward the road. I didn't look back, but I could hear the cabin door finally giving way behind me. Branches tore at my arms as I stumbled through the dark, trying to reach the trail that led to the main road. My lungs burned, my legs heavy, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I saw headlights. A truck came down the road, and I threw myself in front of it, waving wildly. The driver slammed the brakes, cursing as he jumped out. I couldn't speak. I just pointed back toward the woods, toward the cabin. He looked at me like I was insane, but when he saw the terror in my eyes, he helped me climb into his truck and drove me straight into town. I never went back for my things. The police searched the cabin the next day. They found the door broken, the inside torn apart, but no one there. No footprints, no signs of who it had been. They told me it was probably some drifter, someone who had moved on. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and if I had stayed just one more night, I wouldn't have made it out. I had been looking forward to spending some time alone in the small cabin I had rented deep in the woods. Life in the city had been overwhelming for months, and I felt like my head was packed with noise and stress. I wanted quiet, isolation, and a place where I could sit still without hearing car horns, footsteps from upstairs neighbors, or the constant rumble of traffic. A cabin miles away from anyone sounded perfect. The drive was long. The road turned from wide highways into narrower paths, and eventually into a single lane of cracked pavement. After that, it became nothing more than dirt and rocks pressed down by years of occasional vehicles. The trees closed in thick around both sides, tall pines standing in rows that looked like walls. My phone signal dropped bar by bar until there was nothing left, and I didn't mind. I had expected that. The air was cooler, sharper, with the smell of damp earth coming in through the open car window. When I reached the cabin, it was smaller than I expected, but it looked sturdy. The roof sloped low with brown shingles. The wood on the walls faded gray from weather. A small porch wrapped around the front. The windows were narrow and tall, and I could see the dust settled thick on the glass. The lock was stiff when I tried the key, but it opened with a push. Inside was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen tucked in the corner, and a short hallway leading to a single bedroom and bathroom. I unloaded my bags, stacked them by the wall, and started to settle in. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the creak of the floor under my boots, the faint groan of the cabin settling against the wind outside, and my own breath when I stopped moving. That quiet was what I wanted, at least for the first few hours. The first night was easy. I cooked a simple meal on the old gas stove, sat on the wooden chair by the fireplace, and let the silence soak in. I noticed how dark the forest became once the sun went down. The windows looked like black mirrors. There were no lights from neighbors, no glow of distant roads, nothing at all. When I blew out the lantern, the darkness inside was complete, and I lay in bed listening to the occasional crack of a branch outside or the faint whistle of wind through the trees. By the second day, I had fallen into a rhythm. I chopped some wood from the pile out back, carried water from the rain barrel, and explored the trails that disappeared into the woods. The forest was thicker than I expected, and after only a few minutes of walking, the cabin was out of sight. The trails twisted, some of them little more than deer paths, and I found myself turning around often to make sure I remembered the way back. Late that afternoon, I noticed something that unsettled me. I was walking one of the narrower trails when I saw a footprint in the soft dirt. At first, I thought it might have been mine from earlier, but the shape was wrong. It was larger, heavier, with the tread of a boot I didn't recognize. The edges were fresh, not worn down by weather. I stood still for a long moment, listening. The forest was silent except for the occasional call of a bird. I told myself it wasn't strange. People must hike through here sometimes. But I hadn't seen another person since leaving the main road the day before, and the thought of someone else wandering near the cabin made me uneasy. When I got back, I checked the cabin carefully. The door was locked the way I had left it, and nothing inside seemed touched. I told myself it was fine. Still, that night, I found myself listening harder than before, waiting for sounds in the darkness beyond the windows. The next morning, I noticed something else. Behind the cabin, about 30 feet into the trees, there was an old rusted can with holes punched in it, as if it had once been used for burning trash. Around it were scattered bones, small ones probably from animals. Some were old and brittle, others looked more recent, with a yellowish color that hadn't faded yet. I crouched and studied them, wondering if a hunter had been using the spot, or maybe someone camping before me. I didn't like the idea, but I tried not to think too hard about it. I spent the rest of the day inside, reading from a book I had brought. By evening, as the light began to fade, I heard something outside, a crunch like footsteps on dry leaves. My chest tightened. I moved quietly to the window and peered out, but the shadows were thick between the trees, and I couldn't see anyone. The sound didn't come again, but it had been clear, too heavy to be just a squirrel or a raccoon. That night was harder. I lay awake in bed, listening. Every time the cabin creaked, I thought it was something else. I stared at the faint outline of the window until my eyes burned, waiting to see movement against the glass. Nothing came, but sleep didn't come either. The next morning, I found more tracks near the cabin. They were boot prints larger than mine, circling around to the back porch. My stomach turned cold as I crouched to study them. They hadn't been there the day before. Whoever it was, they had been close enough to touch the walls of the cabin if they wanted to. I checked the door and windows again. Locked. Nothing broken. Whoever had been there hadn't forced their way inside. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it worse than it was. Maybe just a hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. But the prints weren't leading away. They circled, stopped near the back, and then vanished into the woods again. I carried a heavy piece of wood into the cabin that day, keeping it by my chair as I sat by the fire. I checked the windows more often, glancing up at every sound. I thought about leaving, but the idea of packing my bags and walking the trail back to the car with someone possibly watching me felt worse than staying. The fourth night was the longest. The noises outside came again, faint but steady. Footsteps on the porch, a soft thud against the wall, the sound of something brushing against the door. My hands were sweating as I sat in the dark, gripping the piece of wood so tightly that my fingers ached. I waited, holding my breath, convinced that any second the door would creak open. But it didn't. When dawn came, I opened the door slowly. On the porch were fresh marks, mud smeared near the handle, as if a dirty hand had rested there. I backed into the cabin and locked it again, my mind racing. Someone had been trying the door while I was inside, sitting only a few feet away. I didn't last another night. As the sun climbed higher, I stuffed my bags quickly, checking the windows every few seconds. My hands shook as I carried everything to the car, loading it as fast as I could. I felt the weight of the trees pressing in, convinced that eyes were on me from the shadows. When I slammed the trunk shut, the sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot, and I nearly dropped the keys. I drove fast, bouncing over the rough dirt road, glancing in the mirror over and over. The forest seemed endless, the trees all the same, and I felt trapped until finally the road widened into pavement again. My shoulders loosened only when I saw the first sign of another car on the highway. For days after, I kept thinking about it. The footprints, the handprints on the porch, the noises in the dark. Someone had been out there watching the cabin, circling it, testing the door. Maybe they had wanted to wait until I left, or maybe they had been waiting for me to fall asleep. I would never know, but what I knew was enough, that the quiet cabin in the woods had not been empty, and the silence had not been mine alone. I had gone out there looking for peace. What I found instead was the feeling of being hunted, the sharp awareness of eyes I couldn't see. I told myself I would never go back to a place like that again. Not alone. Not ever. I drove out to the cabin on a late afternoon in early autumn, when the air was cooler but still carried leftover warmth from summer. The cabin sat deep in the woods, almost 2 hours from the nearest town, at the end of a narrow dirt road that was full of potholes and loose gravel. I had been there before in the summer with a couple of friends, but this time I went alone because I wanted some time away from everything. The cabin belonged to a family friend who let me use it whenever I wanted. It was simple, just one floor with a small kitchen, one bedroom, a bathroom that barely worked, and a wood stove for heating. I reached the cabin as the sun was dropping behind the trees. The woods around it looked darker than I remembered, and the air smelled strongly of wet leaves and pine. I parked my car near the porch and noticed right away how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, not even distant airplane sounds. Just wind moving through the trees and an occasional creak from the woods. I brought in my bags and unpacked slowly, stacking canned food in the little cupboard, setting my flashlight on the counter, laying out the sleeping bag I had brought because I didn't trust the old bed sheets. Everything inside looked the same as before. Old wood floors, a table with uneven legs, dusty curtains that didn't close all the way, and windows that rattled if the wind hit them. By the time I was done, the light outside was almost gone, so I set up a small fire in the wood stove. The crackling sound made the place feel less empty. I heated a can of soup and ate it with crackers, listening to the fire and the faint scratching sounds the forest made at night. First, it was calm. I thought I would enjoy the weekend, no work, no phone signal, no noise. Just me and the woods. But sometime after I finished eating, I noticed something strange. It wasn't a sound or a smell, just the feeling that the woods outside were too quiet. I had camped enough to know that usually, even at night, you hear animals, crickets, frogs, owls. But there was nothing, just silence and the occasional gust of wind. I brushed it off and told myself it was just because the season was changing. Some nights in fall could be quiet. I locked the door, put the flashlight by my sleeping bag, and tried to rest. The first night wasn't bad, but I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of gravel crunching outside. My car was parked close, and I knew that sound well, like someone walking slowly around it. I lay still, holding my breath, and listened hard. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it sounded too heavy, like steady footsteps. They moved slowly past the side of the cabin, then faded. I stayed awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to come back. Didn't. When daylight came, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from dew, and I saw faint marks in the gravel near my car. They weren't clear footprints, but the gravel looked disturbed in places where it hadn't been the night before. My heart raced a little, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe it had been an animal after all. I spent most of that day chopping some of the wood stacked near the shed, just to keep busy. The woods seemed calm again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stopped moving, I swore I heard faint cracks in the trees, like someone stepping on twigs far off. I never saw anything, though, and I told myself I was overthinking. That night, I cooked some rice on the small stove and tried to read a book, but my eyes kept going to the windows. The curtains didn't cover them fully, and every patch of darkness outside felt like it was holding something just out of view. Around midnight, I finally turned in, leaving the lantern off so the inside would be dark too. Again, at some point deep into the night, I woke up. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of my car door handle being pulled. A faint metallic rattle, slow and careful. My chest tightened instantly. I froze, listening as it happened again. Someone was outside trying my car. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, the sound stopped, and after what felt like forever, I heard soft steps moving away into the woods. My mouth was dry, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. I stayed awake till dawn, barely breathing, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. When I finally went out in the morning, I checked the car. The handles had fresh smudges on them, smears of dirt or mud that hadn't been there before. Whoever it was, they had tried all 4 doors. I checked the trunk too, and even the gas cap. Everything was still locked, but the sight made me feel sick. The rest of the day dragged. I didn't want to be outside long, but being inside made me nervous too. I walked the perimeter of the cabin a few times, looking for anything, broken branches, footprints, anything. In some soft dirt near the shed, I found a partial print, maybe from a boot. It wasn't sharp, but it was enough to prove someone had been there. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat in the dark by the stove, listening. For hours, there was nothing, and I almost thought maybe whoever it was had left. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard slow scraping along the wall of the cabin, like something hard being dragged against the wood siding. It started near the back and moved toward the window by the kitchen. My stomach dropped. The scraping stopped. Then there was silence. I didn't dare look out the window. Morning came, and when I went outside, I saw what had made the sound. On the back wall, there were marks, long, fresh scrapes in the wood. They weren't deep, but they were new. Whoever was out there had done it on purpose to let me know. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back to town. But part of me felt stubborn. I told myself maybe it was just some hunter messing around, or kids from a nearby property. Still, I couldn't ignore the sick feeling in my gut. The 4th night was the worst. I had barely eaten all day, too anxious to cook. I sat with the flashlight in my hand, every sound outside making me jump. The woods were so silent it felt like the world had stopped. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of gravel again, slow and steady, circling the cabin. Then it stopped. Minutes passed. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang shook the front door. Not like someone knocking, but like someone had thrown their shoulder into it hard. I leapt up, my heart hammering. I stared at the door, waiting for another hit. It never came. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they could come in if they really wanted to. I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking while I loaded the car, and every second outside felt like I was being watched. I checked the woods constantly, expecting to see someone step out, but no one did. I drove away fast, barely slowing for the rough patches of road. I didn't look back until I hit the highway. Only then did I feel like I could breathe. Later, when I stopped at a gas station miles away, I finally saw something that made it worse. On the back of my car, streaked faintly into the dust on the trunk, were marks. For lines, drawn by a finger, uneven but deliberate. Someone had touched the car while I was sleeping inside that cabin. I never went back. I drove up the winding dirt road later than I planned, the sun already dipping low behind the dark ridges of the forest. The cabin sat miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into the tree line like it had been waiting there for decades. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story wooden place with a small porch and a tin roof that looked older than me. I had been here before once, years ago, but not alone. This time I came by myself, needing space, quiet, and maybe a chance to get away from the constant pull of everything in town. The air was cool when I stepped out of the car. Pine needles were scattered thick across the dirt drive, and the smell of damp earth hung heavy. I grabbed my duffel bag and carried it inside. The door was stiff on its hinges, creaking in a way that echoed through the small interior. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a small wood stove, a couch against the wall, a table and 2 chairs, and a short hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The windows were single pane, framed with thin curtains that barely covered the glass. Dust clung to the corners and cobwebs hung up near the rafters, but it felt quiet, almost too quiet. I put my bag on the couch and walked the rooms to check them, more out of habit than anything. The bedroom had a double bed with a heavy quilt, a dresser that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, and a small closet. The bathroom was even simpler. A cracked sink, a toilet, and a shower stall. The water would come from a pump out back. There was no phone service here. My phone had already dropped to 0 bars 5 miles before the turnoff. That was part of the reason I came, but it hit me again in that moment how truly cut off I was. By the time I unpacked a few things and started a fire in the wood stove, the light outside had almost gone. The forest around the cabin turned dark fast, like someone had pulled a heavy curtain across it. The sound of the wind in the trees was different here, deeper, carrying with it the occasional snap of branches. I made myself a simple meal, canned soup warmed on the stove, and ate it at the table with only the hiss of the fire for company. Not long after, the weather shifted. I could hear the first drops of rain hitting the tin roof, spaced out at first and then heavier until it became a steady drumming. The sound filled the cabin. The wind picked up too, pushing hard against the walls, making the whole structure groan. I checked the front door and the back door just to be sure they were latched, then sat on the couch with the fire glowing faintly in the stove. It wasn't long before I noticed something. At first, it was just the thought of it, a feeling that the storm didn't quite cover every noise. There was something faint beneath it, something out of rhythm with the rain. I sat still, listening harder. The sound came again. It was soft, but it was there. A crunch like a footstep on wet leaves. Then nothing. I told myself it was just the storm knocking branches down. I wanted to believe that, but when I leaned forward and listened again, I heard it once more, closer this time. I stood up and went to the nearest window. The rain streaked the glass, blurring everything beyond. The porch light barely reached past the steps. The trees swayed, black against darker black. I squinted, searching, but saw nothing moving except the storm itself. I stayed there longer than I should have, my eyes straining against the blur of rain. Finally, I stepped back and tried to shake it off. I sat down again, but my body was tight, listening for every little break in the storm's rhythm. Another sound came not long after, this time from the back of the cabin. It was sharper, more distinct. A scrape, not like an animal, too deliberate. I felt the hair on my neck rise. I grabbed the small flashlight I had brought and moved slowly down the hallway toward the back door. The wood floor creaked under me, loud in the silence. I stood near the door, holding my breath, and listened. The storm was heavy on the roof, water pouring off the eaves, but beneath it I could still hear something faint, a dragging sound, like someone moving slowly just beyond the walls. I thought about calling out, but I knew how far I was from anyone. Nobody would hear me, and whoever was outside already knew I was here. I killed the light, not wanting the beam to show through the thin curtain on the window in the door. I stood there in the dark, the storm filling my ears, until finally the sound faded. I backed away and went to the bedroom. I shut the door quietly and sat on the bed, listening hard. My bag was on the couch, my phone inside it, but it didn't matter anyway. No service, no way out until morning, unless I wanted to drive the long dirt road in the storm. I sat there, my heartbeat heavy in my chest, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Minutes dragged on. I don't know how long I sat there before the next sound came. This time there was no mistaking it. A knock, not loud but clear. 3 dull thuds on the back door. My throat went dry. The sound was swallowed quickly by the storm, but it had been real. Someone was at the door. Someone was out there in the rain, knocking, testing. I didn't move for a long time. I sat frozen, barely breathing. The knock didn't come again. Instead, after what felt like forever, I heard the faintest sound of the back door handle turning. Slow, steady, trying it. The latch held. I slid off the bed and crouched low, moving to the dresser. I opened the bottom drawer slowly, quietly. Inside were old blankets, nothing useful. I shut it again, careful not to make noise. I thought about the front door then, if it was locked tight enough. The cabin wasn't built to keep people out. The locks were simple, the kind you could force with a shoulder. I thought about the windows too, thin glass with no real latch strength. If someone wanted in bad enough, they'd get in. That thought chilled me more than the storm outside. Another sound came, this time from the side of the cabin. A thud, low, like someone bumping into the wall or pressing against it. Then again, closer to the bedroom side. I crawled to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to peek. The rain was heavy, but I thought I saw something. A shape, a person standing still, barely visible in the downpour. I let the curtain drop and backed away. My stomach twisted. I didn't know how many there were or what they wanted, but they were here. I decided then that I couldn't just sit and wait. I needed something to defend myself. I went back to the main room, crouching low, moving slow. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving the room dim. I opened the drawer in the small kitchen counter, searching. Old utensils, a rusted can opener, nothing worth much. Then I remembered the hatchet. There had been one outside near the woodpile earlier, but to get it, I'd have to go out the front door. I pressed my back to the wall and thought about it. The front porch was exposed, but maybe whoever was outside was still near the back. If I was quick, maybe I could grab it. I eased toward the front door, every step loud to my ears. I unlocked it slow, the metal clicking softly, then pulled it open just enough to slip out. The rain hit me hard, soaking me instantly. I moved quick to the side of the porch where the woodpile sat. The hatchet was stuck in a split log. I yanked it free, my hand slipping on the wet handle, then turned back toward the door. That's when I saw it. A shape at the edge of the trees, standing still, facing the cabin. I couldn't make out details through the rain, just the outline of a person. My chest tightened. I rushed back inside and slammed the door, bolting it. I stood there dripping, the hatchet in my hand, my breath shaking. I knew for certain now. Someone was out there watching, circling. The hours dragged. Every sound from outside set me on edge. Sometimes it was the storm, sometimes it wasn't. A scrape of metal on wood near the back. A thump against the wall. Once, I swore I heard breathing outside the window. I stayed awake, gripping the hatchet, waiting. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed. The rain stopped, the sky lightened, and the forest outside grew still again. I opened the door cautiously, hatchet ready. The ground was soft and muddy, covered in fresh tracks. Human tracks, several of them circling the cabin, leading in and out of the trees. They hadn't tried to hide it. I followed them only a few steps before stopping. They led back into the forest, deep and endless. Whoever had been there had left before daylight. But they had been close, too close. I went back inside and packed quickly. I didn't stay another night. I drove down that dirt road without looking back, every mile between me and that cabin a weight off my chest. The memory of it stayed though. The sound of the knocks, the handle turning, the figure in the rain. I knew they hadn't come to help, hadn't been lost hikers looking for shelter. They came to see who was alone out here, who was easy to take. If the door had been weaker, if I hadn't woken when I did, the night could have ended different. I never went back to that cabin again. I never thought a short trip alone to a cabin would turn into the hardest and scariest experience of my life. I had stayed in cabins before, usually with friends or family, but this time I went alone. The plan was simple. I wanted peace and quiet away from the city. No distractions, no noise, just me and the woods. I rented a small cabin that was several miles away from the nearest small town. The listing said it was secluded and private, which was exactly what I wanted at first. It was supposed to be a chance to reset my mind, take long walks, write in my journal, and breathe in the silence I couldn't find in my normal life. But I did not realize how different things feel when you are truly alone, and how quickly silence can turn into something threatening when you cannot trust what is outside or even who might be watching you. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The roads got smaller and rougher the further I went. The last 5 miles were just dirt, winding through tall trees that blocked most of the sun. My phone had lost signal about 10 minutes before I reached the cabin. That didn't worry me too much at first, since I knew cabins like this usually didn't have service. When I finally pulled up, I saw it sitting back off the road, tucked between trees. The cabin was plain, made of weathered wood, with a small porch and one step that looked a little uneven. There was a small shed off to the side and a fire pit ring made of stones near the tree line. The place looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer, but it seemed sturdy enough. It had exactly what I thought I wanted: solitude. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a bed against the wall, a small table, a wood stove, and shelves with a few supplies. There was running water from a pump sink, but no electricity. The bathroom was an old-style outhouse behind the shed. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. I set my bag down and felt excited for the first time in weeks. I told myself this was going to be good for me. I even smiled as I unpacked my things, not knowing what was ahead. The first day passed quietly. I gathered wood, started a fire in the stove, and sat outside as the sun went down. The woods around me were dense, with tall pines and thick undergrowth. It felt endless, like I was sitting in the middle of a green ocean. As night fell, I noticed how dark it got. With no nearby houses or lights, the darkness was complete. I could hear insects, the distant call of an owl, and the creak of trees moving in the wind. At first, I enjoyed the raw silence between those sounds. But when I lay down on the bed, every creak, snap, or rustle outside started to feel louder. I told myself it was just animals moving around, branches falling, nothing unusual. Still, I had a hard time sleeping that first night. The second day, I went for a long walk. I followed a rough trail that seemed to loop back toward the cabin after a couple of miles. I carried a small backpack with some water and a knife just in case. The woods were beautiful, but I started to notice how easy it would be to get lost. Everything looked the same: trees, moss, rocks, fallen logs. I was careful not to stray too far from the path. Halfway through, I found a small clearing where the sunlight actually reached the ground. I sat there for a while, eating a snack, but I kept feeling like something was watching me. When I turned my head quickly, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but it could have been an animal. I stood up, suddenly uneasy, and made my way back. When I reached the cabin again, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't expected. That night, things started to feel different. As I sat by the fire outside, I heard movement deeper in the woods. First, I thought it was just a deer, but the steps sounded slow, deliberate, almost like someone walking. I held still, trying to listen. The sound would stop, then start again, always just far enough that I couldn't see. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself my mind was exaggerating because I was alone. Still, I put out the fire earlier than I had planned and went inside, bolting the door. I sat on the bed, listening for a long time. The sound faded eventually, but my nerves didn't. I slept very lightly that night, waking up at every noise. On the third day, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the woods by the shed, I saw footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot. The prints weren't huge, but they were clear. The toes, the heel, the arch. They led from the tree line toward the shed and back again. I froze when I saw them, staring down at the ground. My first thought was that maybe they were old. Maybe another person who stayed at the cabin months ago had walked around barefoot. But the dirt looked freshly disturbed. The edges of the prints were sharp, not weathered or filled with leaves. I crouched down, tracing one with my finger, and felt my chest tighten. Someone had been there very recently. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the ground. More prints circled behind it, then disappeared into the woods. I checked the shed but found nothing unusual. Still, the discovery unsettled me. I tried to calm myself, saying it could have been a hiker who wandered too close. But why barefoot? And why around my cabin? I kept thinking about it as I sat inside. The woods no longer felt peaceful. They felt like a wall hiding whoever might be out there. That night was worse. I had trouble keeping my eyes closed. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of leaves outside, slow steps moving around the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, holding the knife I had kept beside me. The steps circled, then paused near the porch. I stared at the door, every nerve in my body screaming. After a few minutes, the steps moved away again, fading into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the knife, too scared to move. When the sun came up, I forced myself outside. I searched the ground and saw them again. Barefoot prints, fresh, circling the cabin. They stopped near the porch, just as I had heard. Whoever it was had stood there in the middle of the night, only a few feet away from where I was lying inside. I felt sick realizing it. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. I paced around, checked the woods, and debated what to do. I had no cell service, no neighbors nearby, no car that could outrun someone if they wanted to block the road. I thought about leaving, but part of me also didn't want to run in panic. I convinced myself to stay one more night and then leave early the next morning. That was a mistake. The final night was the worst. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. Steps, slower than before, almost dragging. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. This time, they didn't just circle. They stopped right by the window. I stared at the glass, barely breathing, too afraid to move. Then I heard a faint tap. Not loud, just a soft touch against the window. I froze, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The tapping came again, slow, deliberate. I couldn't see anything through the darkness outside, but I knew someone was standing there, watching me. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the tapping stopped, and the steps moved again. They headed toward the shed. I stayed rigid, listening. Then I heard the shed door creak. Whoever it was had gone inside. I didn't know what they wanted, but I didn't wait to find out. My hands shook as I pulled on my boots, grabbed my bag, and quietly unbolted the cabin door. I slipped out into the cold night air, moving as silently as I could toward my car. The woods felt alive around me, every shadow like a threat. I didn't dare use a flashlight. I just walked fast, trying not to trip, until I reached the car. My keys shook in my hand as I unlocked it. I slid inside and started the engine. The sound seemed so loud in the quiet night. As the headlights lit up the trees, I saw movement near the shed. A figure, just at the edge of the light, turned and ran into the woods, barefoot, pale legs flashing between the trees. My stomach dropped, and I slammed the car into gear, speeding down the dirt road. Branches scraped the sides, rocks bounced under the tires, but I didn't slow down. I drove until I reached the main road, then kept going until the first gas station miles away. Only then did I stop, hands shaking, chest tight, drenched in sweat. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to believe I had really made it out. The image of those footprints and that figure stayed burned into my mind. I never went back to that cabin. I never even called the rental owner. I just left it behind, but the thought still follows me. Somewhere deep in those woods, someone is living out there, watching cabins like mine, waiting for people to be alone. And I can't stop thinking about how close they came to opening the door. I had been wanting a break from everything for a long time. Life in the city had been heavy on my mind and body, and I felt like I was running out of air. The noise, the crowded streets, the endless work that followed me even after office hours. It was all too much. I thought the best way to fix myself was to go somewhere far, somewhere still and quiet, a place where I could hear myself think again. A friend of mine once told me about a small cabin his uncle owned, deep in the woods near the mountains, where hardly anyone went. He said it was basic, old, and not very comfortable, but it was silent, far from people, and private. That was exactly what I thought I needed. I packed my things carefully. I brought clothes, food that could last me for at least a week, a first aid kit, my knife, a flashlight, a heavy jacket, matches, and my sleeping bag. I had been warned that the cabin wasn't fancy, so I knew I had to take the things that would keep me warm and safe. The drive itself was long. I left the city around early afternoon, and the deeper I went into the countryside, the more the air felt different. Cleaner, sharper, almost biting. When I rolled down the window, the sky grew wider and the road got lonelier. By the time I turned off the paved road and onto the dirt path that led up to the woods, I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The dirt road was rough, full of rocks and holes, and I drove slowly to keep my car from breaking down in the middle of nowhere. The trees grew thicker as I moved forward, the light dimming as if the forest wanted to swallow me whole. My phone lost signal long before I reached the end of the road. That didn't worry me too much. I had been told that would happen. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I had imagined. It sat in a small clearing, the wood dark and worn from years of rain and wind. The roof sagged a little on one side, and the windows were dusty, but it stood strong. Behind it, the forest seemed endless. The silence around me felt heavy, like a blanket pressed against my ears. I cut the engine and just sat there for a moment, looking at the place where I would spend the next several days. I carried my things inside. The door creaked loudly when I opened it, and the smell inside hit me. Old wood, dust, and a faint scent of dampness. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen area on one side, a stone fireplace, and a bed against the far wall. There was also a narrow door that led to a tiny bathroom. No running water, only a bucket and basin setup. It was rough, but I could handle it. I wasn't here for comfort. I was here to clear my head. The first day passed without much trouble. I unpacked, swept the floor, and lit a small fire in the fireplace to warm the place up. I cooked some food on my small portable stove, sat on the bed, and let the silence settle in. The quiet was so deep it almost rang in my ears. At night, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and listened to the sounds outside. The forest was alive, even if I couldn't see it. Branches cracked now and then, something rustled in the brush, and the wind whistled through the trees. I told myself it was all normal. Out here, animals moved freely. I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I decided to explore a little. I walked along the tree line, keeping the cabin in sight, just to get a feel for the land. The forest was thick, the ground soft with old leaves and pine needles. I saw no trails, no signs of people, nothing but endless trees. That was part of the charm. Still, I made sure not to wander too far. I didn't want to risk losing my way. By the second night, I started noticing things that unsettled me. Small details, nothing huge at first. I had stacked the woodpile neatly beside the cabin, but in the morning, A few logs were scattered across the ground as if someone had kicked them. I thought maybe an animal had come by during the night, looking for insects or food. It was possible. But later, when I went to wash the cooking pan outside, I noticed faint boot prints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I checked. The tread was different, wider. That discovery made me uneasy. I told myself it could have been an old print, left by someone weeks or months before. The cabin did belong to someone, after all. Maybe a hunter had passed through at some point. I tried to let it go. On the third night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest outside seemed too restless. I heard something moving slowly around the clearing, crunching the leaves, then stopping, then moving again. I froze in my bed, listening hard. My hand gripped the knife I had brought, even though I knew it would do little against a wild animal. The steps circled the cabin for a long time. I didn't dare get up to look through the window. The fire had burned low, and the room was dark. My mind kept racing, imagining shapes standing outside in the trees. When morning came, I went out to check. The ground was damp from dew, and clear footprints circled the cabin. Boots for sure, fresh ones. My stomach sank. Someone had been walking around while I tried to sleep. From that point on, I couldn't relax. Every sound put me on edge. I cooked less, kept the fire smaller, and stayed inside more often. I started barricading the door at night with the small table and chair, even though I knew it wouldn't hold if someone really wanted to come in. The fourth day was worse. I had gone to gather more firewood from a short distance into the trees. When I came back, I saw something on the cabin door, a mark scratched into the wood. It wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. 3 long vertical lines dragged from top to bottom. It wasn't the claw of an animal. It was too even, too controlled. I stared at it for a long time before going inside. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, a noise would pull me back. Soft footsteps on the leaves, a creak on the porch. Once, I thought I heard the doorknob rattle gently, like someone was testing it. My chest tightened with every sound. The hours dragged. By the 5th morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed my bag quickly, shoving everything inside. I felt watched the entire time. My skin prickled as though eyes were on me from the tree line. When I finally stepped outside, I scanned the woods, but nothing moved. The silence was too thick. I loaded my things into the car and got in. The engine coughed before starting. I felt a wave of relief when it finally roared to life. I backed out of the clearing, my eyes flicking constantly to the mirrors. The trees swallowed the cabin as I drove away, and I swore I saw movement in the shadows. Something human-shaped slipping back into the forest. The drive back down the dirt road was slow, but I didn't stop for anything. Every bend, every corner, I expected to see someone standing there. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When I finally reached the paved road, I didn't look back. I drove for hours until I saw the first gas station. I pulled in, shut off the car, and sat there shaking. My body felt weak, like it had been carrying weight for days. I went inside, bought a bottle of water, and drank it in one go. People moved around me, laughing, talking, normal life all around, but I felt cut off, like I had just come back from another world. I never went back to that cabin. I never told my friend what happened, not in full. I just said it wasn't for me, but the truth stayed in my head. Someone had been out there watching me, circling me, marking the cabin, walking around while I tried to sleep. They never showed their face, never tried to break in, but they wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me afraid, and it worked. Even now, sometimes at night, when the world outside my window is quiet, I think about those footsteps circling the cabin in the dark. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. I drove up to the cabin late in the afternoon, the tires crunching against the gravel road that wound its way higher into the forested hills. The sky was heavy with a dull gray light, the kind that made everything look flatter and colder than it really was. The trees on both sides of the road bent inward, their branches twisting above me like a tunnel, and I had to keep the headlights on even though it wasn't night yet. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a man I knew through a friend who let people use it as long as they respected it and didn't leave it trashed. He told me it was remote, quiet, and a good place to disconnect for a while. That was exactly what I wanted. I had been feeling restless, tired of my usual routines, and thought a few days alone might clear my head. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I killed the engine and just sat in the driver's seat for a minute, listening to how empty it all sounded. The woods swallowed up the noise of the car as soon as it stopped. No voices, no traffic, no hum of distant roads. Just trees, air, and the faint hiss of wind moving through branches. The cabin itself was small and simple, built from dark logs that had aged rough over the years. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch was littered with pine needles. It looked used but not abandoned, the kind of place that seemed sturdy even if it wasn't perfect. I carried my bags inside. The door creaked when I pushed it open, but the hinges held strong. Inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust, with a touch of damp earth, like the scent of old soil rising from the ground itself. The main room was just a square space with a wood stove against one wall, a small table, and a couch that looked like it had been patched over the years. The back room was the bedroom, where a simple bed frame with a thin mattress sat beneath a single window that looked out at the trees. There was no running water and no power, only a lantern and a few candles set out on the table. I unpacked slowly, putting down my gear, checking the woodpile, and making sure I knew where everything was. The woodpile was decent, stacked along the side of the cabin under a lean-to roof. It looked like it would last a few days easily. I brought a few logs in right away and got a fire going in the stove. The sound of the fire cracking filled the silence, and the warmth spread slowly into the room. It was comforting, but at the same time, it reminded me how cut off I was. The first night passed quietly. I cooked some food I had brought, sat near the fire, and read a little by lantern light. When I went to bed, the mattress was lumpy, but the silence outside was complete. I slept heavier than I thought I would, waking only once to the sound of something moving in the trees outside. I brushed it off as a deer or maybe a raccoon and went back to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore. I walked around the woods near the cabin, sticking close at first so I wouldn't lose track of where I was. The forest was thick, with pine and spruce trees stretching high overhead, their needles carpeting the ground so thickly that my footsteps barely made a sound. I noticed animal tracks in a patch of mud near a small stream. Deer, maybe fox, maybe something else I didn't recognize. The air was crisp and sharp, the kind that felt good to breathe in deeply, but it also carried a stillness that made me feel watched, even though I knew I was alone. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon again, and I settled into the routine of preparing for night. Firewood, food, lanterns. Everything felt steady until just after dark. I was sitting at the table when I heard it. Faint at first, but distinct enough to raise every hair on my arms. It was the sound of movement outside, not in the soft way animals move, but heavier, slower, like footsteps. They weren't close at first, but I caught them between the rustles of trees, the crunch of pine needles, and the shift of weight against the ground. I froze, holding my breath, listening harder. The footsteps didn't come closer. They circled. I couldn't see out well. The lantern light inside made the windows into mirrors, and the dark outside pressed in thickly. I got up quietly, moved to the stove, and let the fire dim a little so the light wouldn't shine so bright. That way I could see out better. I stood at the window and stared into the woods. Nothing, just shadows between the trunks, the blackness stretching deeper than my eyes could follow. I told myself it could be a moose, or maybe even the echo of branches breaking under the wind. But something in me knew it wasn't. It was too steady, too deliberate. After a long time, the sounds faded away, and I was left standing there with my own reflection looking back at me in the glass. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard the crunch again, faintly, somewhere outside. At some point I drifted off, but I woke up in the dark before dawn, my throat dry and my chest tight with unease. The morning light should have eased me, but it didn't. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air hitting my face, and scanned the clearing. The dirt around the cabin showed signs that weren't there before. Faint impressions, smudges in the soil, marks that looked too long for boots, too flat for animals. I crouched down and stared at them, trying to make sense of it, but the ground was hard enough that nothing showed in sharp detail. Just the suggestion of someone or something having moved near the cabin while I slept. I spent the rest of the day restless. I kept going back to the window, scanning the woods, jumping at small sounds that normally wouldn't bother me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the drive was long, and part of me didn't want to run just because of noises I couldn't explain. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but deep down I wasn't sure I believed it. When night fell again, I felt the weight of it heavier than before. The fire in the stove seemed too small, the lantern too dim, the cabin too thin between me and the forest. I tried to distract myself with reading, but every page blurred because my ears were straining for sounds. It didn't take long. The footsteps returned. This time closer, this time slower. I held my breath and sat completely still, the book limp in my hands. I could hear the crunch of weight shifting, deliberate pauses, the faint scrape of something brushing bark. My skin prickled, and my stomach twisted. I leaned toward the window and forced myself to look. First, I saw nothing. Then, for the briefest second, I thought I caught movement. A darker shadow among the trees, taller than I expected, standing too still. I blinked, and it was gone, or maybe it had never been there. Maybe it was just the play of my own mind. But the footsteps kept circling. I didn't go to bed. I stayed awake all night, clutching a piece of firewood like a weapon. The lantern dimmed low, the fire nearly out. The noises continued for hours before finally, mercifully, fading into silence again. When morning came, I stepped outside and scanned the ground again. This time there were more signs, more impressions in the dirt, more smudges where someone had been standing just beyond the porch. Whoever it was, they had been close, too close. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay. It didn't matter if I was imagining things, if it was a hunter or a lost hiker or something else. Someone had been outside my cabin, circling me, watching, and I knew if I stayed, they might not stop at just circling. I packed quickly, stuffing my gear back into bags, shoving food into containers. I didn't even bother cleaning up. The only thing I cared about was leaving. The whole time I packed, my ears strained for movement outside. Every time the wind shifted, I jumped. Every creak of the cabin sounded like someone pressing against the wall. By the time I got everything in the car, my hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice before finally getting them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, louder than I had ever heard it, echoing across the clearing. For a moment, I swore I saw something move between the trees at the edge of the clearing, but I didn't stop to look closer. I drove down the gravel road, faster than I should have, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see someone step into the road behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the first town, miles away, where the sight of people walking the streets and cars parked along the curbs felt like a shield I had been desperate for. Only then did I let myself breathe properly, the tension unwinding from my chest. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked who might have been out there, and I never told the man who owned it about what happened. Even now, I still don't know if it was a stranger living in those woods, a hunter watching me for some reason, or something else I'll never be able to explain. But what I do know is this: those footsteps were real, those marks in the dirt were real, and whoever was circling that cabin in the dark had no reason to be there except me. And that was reason enough to leave and never return. I decided to spend a few days alone at a cabin deep in the woods. The idea had been growing in my mind for a long time. I thought being away from everything would clear my head. I had been under stress for months, and I wanted silence, just me and the trees. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who let me use it whenever I wanted, as long as I locked it up properly before leaving. It was a small wooden place with one bedroom, a kitchen, a living space with a fireplace, and a back porch that faced the forest. The cabin sat at the end of a long dirt road that twisted through heavy woods. When I pulled up in my truck, The sun was already dropping behind the trees. The cabin looked the same as always, but every time I saw it, it gave me a strange feeling. It was isolated, with no other houses anywhere nearby. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. No phone signal worked out there. There was no internet either. Only an old radio that sometimes picked up static-filled stations if I positioned it just right. The silence felt heavy as soon as I got out of the truck. Only the sound of wind moving through the tall trees filled the air. I carried in my supplies: canned food, water jugs, a flashlight, extra batteries, and some basic tools. I also had a hunting knife, a hatchet, and a small first aid kit. The cabin had no electricity except what came from a loud generator that sat outside behind it. I rarely turned that on unless I needed to. Most of the time I used a lantern or candles. That first evening I kept it simple. I set my things inside, made a quick meal, and sat on the porch until it got too dark to see. The woods grew darker in a way that felt different from the city. Out there, when night fell, it was complete. No streetlights, no faint glow on the horizon, just blackness that pressed against the windows. That night, I slept in the cabin's single bed. I left the window slightly cracked to hear the forest air, but after a while the sound started to feel strange. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, and now and then I thought I heard something heavier moving in the distance. Could have been deer, raccoons, or even a bear. I tried not to think about it. I shut the window and lay awake for a long time before finally drifting off. The next morning, I woke up with sunlight spilling through the curtains. I brewed coffee on the small propane stove, ate a can of beans, and walked around the property. The cabin stood in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick woods. There was a narrow trail that ran behind it and disappeared into the trees. I followed it for about half a mile until it crossed a stream, then turned back. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. Felt like the woods were watching. Later that day, I chopped some firewood and stacked it near the porch. I swept the inside of the cabin, checked the locks, and made sure the generator still worked. The air smelled sharp, like pine needles and damp earth. The day passed slowly. With no phone and nothing to distract me, I was forced to just sit and listen. The silence got heavier as the evening came again. That night, things changed. I had gone to bed around 10. The lantern was off, and the cabin was completely dark. I was half asleep when I thought I heard something outside. At first, it sounded like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. I told myself it was probably an animal sniffing around. The wood creaked again, heavier this time, like weight pressing down. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I waited, every muscle tight. After a long time of silence, I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. The wood looked the same. I walked around the cabin, scanning the dirt for tracks. Near the steps, I saw faint marks in the ground. They weren't clear enough to tell for sure, but they didn't look like animal prints. They looked more like the outline of a boot. The thought unsettled me, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were my own from last night when I unloaded the truck. Still, I knew they didn't look like mine. My boots had a deep tread. These looked smoother, flatter. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped more wood, kept the fire going, and tried to read an old book I had brought. But I couldn't concentrate. Every sound outside pulled my attention. The woods seemed louder than usual. Branches cracked in the distance. Birds flew suddenly from the trees, like something had startled them. By late afternoon, I decided to make sure all the windows and doors were secure. The cabin's doors were old but solid. The locks worked fine. I set my hunting knife on the table beside the bed. I also kept the flashlight close. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint scratching sound on the back wall of the cabin. It was steady, like something dragging across the wood. My chest tightened. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound, but the curtains blocked my view. The scratching went on for several minutes, then stopped. I stayed awake, straining to hear, but there was only silence again. When morning came, I went straight outside to check. The back wall of the cabin had several fresh marks on the wood. Long, thin scratches. They were too high up to be from a small animal, too controlled to be random. Someone had done it on purpose. I felt a cold wave of fear run through me. Someone was out there and they knew I was inside. I decided to stay another day only because I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down I knew this wasn't my imagination. That day dragged on endlessly. I barely ate. I just sat inside most of the time listening. I kept the curtains closed, not wanting to give anyone a clear view inside. Several times I thought I heard movement in the woods, a branch snapping, leaves crunching. When I looked out, I saw nothing. By nightfall, I was tense and exhausted. I locked the doors again, double-checked the windows, and sat in the dark with only the faint glow of the lantern. Hours passed in silence, until again, sometime after midnight, I heard the porch creak. Slow footsteps, not moving across, just 1 or 2 steps. Then stillness. My skin prickled. Then something hit the side of the cabin. A sharp knock, like someone striking the wall with a fist. Then another knock, harder this time. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I didn't move. I just sat frozen in the dark, gripping the knife in one hand, the flashlight in the other. Minutes passed. Then silence again. At dawn, I stepped outside carefully. Nothing was there. The woods looked the same, calm and empty. But when I checked the side of the cabin, there were fresh dents in the wood where something had hit it. Fist-sized dents. I knew then I couldn't stay. Someone was trying to scare me, maybe worse. I packed my things quickly, loading the truck. My hands shook as I worked. The whole time I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting someone to step out. As I slammed the truck door shut and started the engine, I caught something in the corner of my eye, movement deep in the trees. I looked hard, but whatever it was had already slipped back into the forest. I drove away fast, my tires kicking dirt down the long road. The cabin disappeared behind the trees. I didn't slow down until I reached the paved highway miles away. Even then, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. Spend a week alone in a cabin far from town, away from everything that filled my daily life with noise and routine. I wanted the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, the type you could feel in your chest when you woke up in the middle of the night and realized the world outside was completely still. I rented a small wooden cabin deep in the forest through a listing I had found online. The photos showed a simple place. One main room with a bed, a stove, a small table, and a fireplace. There was no electricity, no running water, no phone signal, just wood, stone, and the long stretch of trees around it. I drove up in the late afternoon on a narrow dirt road that twisted deeper and deeper into the forest until it finally ended at a clearing where the cabin stood. The wood of the cabin was dark, weathered by time, but sturdy. The roof sloped low and was covered with brown shingles that looked like they had been nailed down many times over the years. The small porch creaked when I stepped onto it, but it felt solid. I unlocked the door with the key that had been left for me under a flat rock by the front steps. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old pine. The interior was simple. The bed was pushed against one wall, covered with a thin mattress and an old wool blanket. The fireplace took up the corner opposite the door. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood near a single window. The stove was small and metal, the kind you could light with wood or charcoal. There were shelves against the wall, empty except for a few dusty jars. The cabin felt like it hadn't been used in a long time, but it was clean enough. Outside, the forest pressed close. The trees were tall and thick, blocking most of the sky. The clearing around the cabin was just wide enough to let in some light. But as soon as you stepped into the trees, the ground turned darker and cooler. I carried in my supplies: food, water jugs, a lantern, batteries, a hunting knife, an old camping axe, and a first aid kit. I stacked the firewood I had brought by the fireplace, knowing the nights would be cold. The first evening passed quietly. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, ate at the table, and then stepped outside as the sun went down. The forest grew dim quickly, the trees swallowing the light as if it fell into them. The air turned cooler, and I listened to the sounds that filled the woods. The distant calls of birds settling down, the rustle of leaves as small animals moved across the ground. Once darkness fell, the silence deepened. There were no cars, no voices, no lights in the distance. Only the faint crackle of the fire behind me and the whisper of wind moving through the branches. When I finally went to bed, the quiet was so complete it pressed into me. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, the faint beat of my heart in my ears. Sleep came slowly, but it came. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the cracks around the window. The forest was damp with dew. I made breakfast and decided to walk down the old trail that led deeper into the woods. The owner of the cabin had mentioned it in a message, saying it went on for miles but eventually crossed a creek where the water was safe to drink. I took a small pack with water, a snack, and my knife. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and the deeper I went, the more I felt the forest close in around me. After half an hour of walking, the cabin was long gone from sight and sound. The air was cooler under the trees, heavy with the smell of damp earth. I reached the creek, clear and shallow, running over smooth rocks. I crouched, splashed water on my face, and sat there for a while listening to the sound of it moving. That was when I noticed something strange. Across the creek on the opposite bank, the ground was disturbed. The leaves were pressed down, and the dirt was churned as though someone had stood there for a while or moved back and forth. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but the shape was wide and flat, more like footprints. I leaned closer, but from where I stood, I couldn't make them out clearly. I felt a flicker of unease, but shook it off. Animals made all kinds of marks. I stayed another few minutes, then turned back to the cabin. The walk back felt different, though. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me glance around. It felt like the woods were watching me. By the time I reached the clearing, I felt relieved to see the cabin again. The rest of the day passed quietly. I chopped some wood, read from a book I had brought, and made dinner as the sun set. But that night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, a soft crunching sound, like someone walking slowly across the clearing. I held my breath and listened hard. The sound came again, then stopped. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, and the room was filled with faint shadows. I stared at the ceiling, every muscle tense, until finally, after what felt like an hour, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The following morning, I stepped outside and walked slowly around the cabin. The ground was soft from dew, and that was when I saw them. Prints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They weren't from a deer. They weren't from a bear either. They were from boots. Human boots. The prints led out of the trees and stopped just a few feet from the cabin, then turned and went back. Someone had walked right up to the edge of the clearing and then left. I stood there staring at the marks, my heart pounding. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was an old hunter passing through. Maybe someone else used the trail. But why come so close to the cabin and then leave? Why not knock or say something? The unease settled deeper inside me. I spent the day keeping busy, stacking more wood, checking my supplies, staying alert. I didn't go far from the cabin. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper, closer. That night, I made sure the fire was strong in the fireplace and that my lantern was full. I laid the axe near the bed. Sleep was hard to find. Several times I thought I heard noises outside again. The faint crunch of leaves, the snapping of a twig. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I sat up quickly, nothing was there. The days that followed blurred together. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the prints had been old, that the noises were animals, but the feeling of being watched never left. Each morning, I walked the edge of the clearing and checked the ground. Some days I found nothing. Other days, I saw faint new marks, as though someone had passed by in the night, keeping just out of reach, just out of sight. I stopped going down the trail. I kept the axe close at all times. I started sleeping in short bursts, waking often to listen. The turning point came on the 5th night. I woke suddenly, though I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned low, leaving the room dim. My ears strained in the silence, and that was when I heard it. The faint, deliberate sound of a footstep on the porch outside. Then another. The boards creaked softly under the weight. I didn't move. My hand slowly found the axe by my bed. My chest tightened as I listened. The footsteps moved across the porch, slow, careful. They stopped right by the door. The silence stretched on. I held my breath, gripping the axe so tightly my hand ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the boards creaked again. The footsteps moved away, slow at first, then fading into the night. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat upright in bed, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. It never did. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch. The boards still held the faint scuff marks of boots. Whoever had come up there had stood right by the door, just standing, listening, watching. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my supplies quickly, stuffing them back into the bag. I loaded everything into my truck, my hands shaking. As I turned the key, the engine coughed, then roared to life. I glanced one last time at the cabin. It looked the same as when I had first arrived. Quiet, still, surrounded by the trees. But the silence now felt different, felt heavy, threatening. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees behind me. The forest swallowed the cabin quickly, and then it was gone. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, miles away from the woods. Only then did the tightness in my chest begin to ease. I never went back. And even now, when I think of that cabin, I don't picture the quiet evenings by the fire or the sound of the creek. I only remember the prints in the dirt, the footsteps on the porch, and the thought that someone had been out there the whole time, waiting, watching, and never saying a word. I had planned the trip for months before it finally happened. The cabin I chose was a small one, hidden deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest small town. I had rented it for a week, thinking it would give me the peace I needed to clear my mind. I had been stressed for a long time, my work and daily life leaving me drained. I thought isolation would do me good. The idea of being away from noise, people, and constant distractions felt like the only way to reset myself. The drive there had been long and quiet. The closer I got, the more narrow the roads became. Asphalt turned into gravel, then into dirt paths lined by thick trees on both sides. I passed no other cars, and by the last half hour of driving, it felt like the world around me had emptied completely. The GPS lost signal at some point, and I had to rely on printed directions from the cabin's owner. I followed them carefully, turning at landmarks like an old rusted mailbox and a crooked pine tree. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. It sat in a clearing surrounded by forest on all sides. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof slanted, and the windows small. There was a narrow porch with a single chair, and the door looked like it had been replaced more than once over the years. I parked my car on the side, on a patch of dirt that looked like it had been used as a driveway before. The nearest sign of people was miles away. First, it felt nice. The air was cold, and the silence was heavy but calm. I carried my bags inside. The cabin had one main room with a bed in the corner, a small wood stove, a table, and some shelves with old tools and supplies. There was no electricity, only lanterns and candles. A small kitchen space with a hand pump for water sat in the corner. Behind the main room was a small bathroom with a compost toilet. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my food, which was mostly canned goods and dry snacks. I set up my sleeping bag on top of the bed, since the sheets looked a little too old and dusty for comfort. I gathered some firewood stacked on the porch and started a small fire in the stove. By the time it was dark, I had a small meal and sat listening to the sounds outside. The woods creaked, leaves shifted with the wind, and every now and then I could hear what sounded like distant animals. It was what I expected, silence broken by nature. That night I slept uneasy. The cabin made noises I wasn't used to. The wood popped, the wind pressed against the walls, and every small sound outside felt louder than it should. At one point, I woke up to what I thought was movement near the porch, like someone had stepped on the boards outside. I froze, listening hard, but heard nothing after. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, Still, I found myself staring at the ceiling for a long time before I drifted off again. The next day, I decided to walk around the area to get familiar with it. I followed a narrow path behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the trees stood tall and thick, blocking most of the light. The path wound down toward a small creek where the water was shallow and slow. I stood there for a while, listening to the water before heading back. On my way, I noticed something strange. About 50 yards from the cabin, off the path, there was a spot where the ground looked disturbed. The soil had been dug up and pressed down again. It wasn't fresh, but it stood out. It was an area about 3 feet wide, rectangular, like someone had buried something there. I stared at it for a while, feeling a knot in my stomach. My first thought was that maybe an animal had dug and someone covered it back. But the shape looked too clean, too neat, almost like a shallow grave. I told myself I was being paranoid. People used the woods for all kinds of things. Maybe it was just trash or old tools someone buried. Back at the cabin, I tried to put it out of my mind. I made lunch, wrote a little in a notebook, and read by lantern light as evening came. But when it got dark, I couldn't shake the image of that disturbed ground. I told myself not to think about it. Still, I barely slept that night. The third day was worse. The weather turned colder, with thick clouds blocking the sun. The woods felt darker and heavier. I spent most of the day inside, trying to distract myself. But by late afternoon, I noticed something outside that froze me. On the dirt near the porch steps, there were prints. They weren't animal prints. They looked like shoe prints. They led up to the porch, then back into the woods. I hadn't seen them before. My heart thudded in my chest as I crouched to look closer. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the prints were clear. Someone had walked right up to the cabin. I couldn't tell when, but it didn't look old. The edges were still sharp, not washed out. I looked around the trees but saw nothing. The woods were too thick, too quiet. I locked the door that night, even though it was just an old latch that didn't feel strong. I sat awake for hours, every sound outside making me flinch. The fire in the stove burned low, and I let it die out because I didn't want the light to show through the windows. I stayed in the dark, listening, straining to hear anything. At one point, I heard something again on the porch, slow, deliberate steps. The boards creaked just once, then silence. I held my breath, gripping a heavy flashlight in my hand, staring at the door. I never heard the steps move away, but eventually, the silence returned. The next morning, I opened the door carefully. The dirt showed more prints. They were right by the door, as if someone had stood there, waiting. My stomach turned. I checked the windows, and one of them had a smudge, like a handprint on the outside glass. I didn't know what to do. I had no phone signal, no internet. The car was my only way out, but the thought of driving down those narrow dirt roads with someone possibly watching made me hesitate. I told myself maybe it was just hunters or hikers who passed by, but why come up to the cabin? Why stand on the porch? Why leave prints at the door and hand marks on the glass? That day, I stayed inside with the door locked. I kept the flashlight close, along with a small hatchet I found in the cabin. Every now and then I looked out the windows, scanning the trees. I thought I saw movement once or twice, but it could have been the wind. By evening, I was exhausted but wired with fear. I decided I would leave in the morning. I packed some of my things, keeping only what I needed for the night out. I didn't want to go into the dark woods in the middle of the night, but I knew I couldn't stay longer. That night was the worst. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining. Around midnight, the noises started again. First, faint movement outside. Then, the sound of the porch creaking. Slow, steady weight shifting on the boards. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow. I gripped the hatchet, my palms sweating. The creak stopped. Then, a faint scratching sound at the window. My skin went cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The scratching lasted only a few seconds, then silence. For hours, I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the pale light of dawn. I got up quickly, heart pounding, and checked outside. More prints. This time, they circled the cabin. Whoever it was, they had walked around and around in the night. I felt sick looking at them. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bags, threw them in the car, and started the engine. The dirt road was rough, but I drove fast, my hands shaking on the wheel. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I finally saw other cars and signs of town, I felt my body loosen for the first time in days. I drove straight home, not stopping once. Even now, I don't know who it was or why they came. Maybe it was someone living in those woods, watching. Maybe it was someone who knew the cabin was empty most of the time. All I know is the prints were real, the handprint on the glass was real, and the sound of slow steps on the porch still rings in my ears when I think about it. I never went back, and I never will. I had planned on spending a week at the small cabin that sat deep in the woods, far away from the noise of town and the constant distractions of daily life. It was supposed to be quiet, simple, and uneventful. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my family, and it had been sitting and used for years. I thought a week out there would be the perfect way to clear my head. I brought enough food for the days, extra clothes, a first aid kit, a hunting knife, and a heavy flashlight. I thought I was prepared for everything, but what happened there was not something I could have ever planned for. The drive out took most of the afternoon. By the time I reached the dirt road that led into the trees, the sun was low and the light was starting to dim. The road was rough, full of stones and deep ruts, and I could feel the car bouncing with every turn. I kept telling myself the cabin would be worth it, that once I got there and lit the small wood stove inside, I could relax. I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. It looked just like I remembered it. A single-room structure with dark wood, a small porch, and a crooked chimney. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid enough. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and went inside. Dust covered most of the surfaces, but it wasn't bad. The air smelled stale, a mix of old wood and damp earth. I opened the single window and let the cool air in. Then I set about making it livable. I stacked wood beside the stove, unpacked my food, and laid my sleeping bag out on the cot. Once the fire caught and the inside warmed, it felt almost cozy. I ate a simple meal, read for a while, and listened to the night sounds through the thin walls. The forest was full of insects, the occasional crack of a branch, and the distant call of some animal. I wasn't nervous, at least not yet. Felt normal. The first night passed without trouble, but the second night was different. It started with a noise. At first I thought it was just the fire shifting, but then I heard it again. Something outside, close to the cabin. A slow crunching sound, like boots on dry leaves. I sat still and listened. The sound paused, then came again. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe a bear passing through. That was common enough. But the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were too steady, too even. I killed the lantern and sat in the dark. My heart was beating hard, and I strained to hear. The steps circled the cabin. Slow, careful. Whoever or whatever it was, it knew where I was, and it wasn't moving off into the woods. It was moving around me. I gripped the hunting knife I had brought. I wanted to believe it was just my nerves, that maybe the night was tricking my ears, but deep down I knew there was someone out there. I waited for a long time, not daring to move. After maybe an hour, the sounds stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground around the cabin was soft with dirt and pine needles. It didn't take long to see the prints. They weren't from any animal. They were from boots, large ones. Whoever had been there had walked around the cabin more than once. Some tracks stopped close to the window. That was when the reality set in. I was not alone out there. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had already committed myself to staying for the week. I told myself it was probably just some hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That day, I didn't go far. I gathered wood, checked the car, and made sure my supplies were in order. But I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly. Every noise in the woods made me tense. I carried the knife on me everywhere, even when I just stepped outside to get water. When night came again, the fear grew worse. The second night, I tried to sleep but woke to more sounds outside. This time it was sharper. The snap of twigs, the crunch of heavy steps, then silence. I turned off the lantern again and waited in the dark, knife in hand. The steps came closer. I heard breathing, faint but real, just outside the wall where my cot was. I barely moved. I thought about making a run for the car, but I knew whoever was out there would hear me. My only chance was to stay quiet. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, until the sounds faded again. The next morning, I went outside and checked. More prints. Deeper this time, like the person had been standing still near the wall. My stomach sank when I saw something else. Marks on the window frame, where someone had pressed their fingers against the glass. That day, I made a plan. I knew I couldn't keep sitting there, waiting for whatever this was to get worse. I thought about leaving immediately, but part of me wanted to know who it was. And part of me, maybe the stubborn part, didn't want to be chased away. I stacked more wood inside, set up a small barricade by the door, and kept the knife at my side. The third night was the worst. It started the same. Steps, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I sat in the dark, clutching the knife, every muscle tight. But then there was something new. A sound at the door. A soft rattle, then the scrape of metal. They were trying the lock. My throat tightened. The lock on that old cabin wasn't much, just a rusty latch. It wouldn't hold long. I pressed my back against the door and held the knife out, as if that would stop someone from pushing through. The rattle stopped, then silence again. I thought maybe they had gone, but then I heard movement at the window. The faintest creak, like weight pressing against it. I stayed frozen, not daring to breathe. After a while, the sounds faded again. When dawn came, I went out to check. This time, the prints were clearer. Large boots, wide steps, circling again and again. At the door, the dirt was scuffed where they had stood for a long time. At the window, smudges on the glass where a face had pressed close. That was when I knew it wasn't random. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They knew I was alone, and they were watching me. I decided to leave that morning. I packed my bag, loaded the car, and started down the dirt road. But after only a mile or two, I saw something that froze me. A tree had fallen across the road. A large one, too heavy to move. It hadn't been there when I drove in. The cut at the base was fresh, clean from a saw. It wasn't an accident. Someone had blocked the only way out. I backed the car up and drove back to the cabin. My hands were shaking the whole time. I knew now without a doubt that this was planned. Someone was out there and they wanted me trapped. The days that followed blurred together in fear and exhaustion. I rationed my food, checked the cabin constantly, and barely slept. Every night the footsteps came, sometimes close, sometimes farther, but always there, always circling. On the fifth night, I heard something worse, the sound of my car door opening. I had locked it, but old locks are easy to pry. I stayed inside the cabin, terrified, listening as the car door opened and shut, then silence. In the morning, I checked. The glove box had been rifled through, my maps torn. The gas can I had brought was gone. They wanted me stuck. By the sixth night, I was breaking down. The constant fear, the lack of sleep, the isolation. It all piled on me. My hands shook constantly, and I jumped at every sound. The firewood was running low, and the nights were cold. I knew I couldn't last much longer like that. That night, instead of waiting in the dark, I made a choice. I stayed awake with the lantern off, crouched near the door, knife ready. I knew they would come back, and I wanted to see if I could catch them, or at least understand who they were. Hours passed. Then I heard it, the slow, steady steps. They circled again, just like before. Then they stopped at the door. The rattle came, soft at first, then harder. My pulse roared in my ears. I held my breath, ready to fight if the door gave in. Then, without warning, the steps moved away, into the woods, fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed awake until dawn, shaking. When I finally stepped outside, the prints were there again. This time, though, they led away from the cabin and deeper into the forest. I knew I had one chance, I grabbed my bag, the knife, and the flashlight. I followed the tracks. They led through the trees, winding and twisting, but always clear. After an hour, I came to a small clearing. There was a camp, a makeshift tent made from a tarp, a fire pit with cold ashes, and scattered belongings. Food wrappers, an old backpack, and tools. But what froze me was what I saw hanging from a tree branch. My gas can, half empty, and beside it, my spare clothes that had been in the car. Whoever it was, they had been living out there, watching me, waiting. I didn't stay long. I turned and ran back to the cabin, packed what little I had, and made a decision. The road was blocked, but if I followed the forest line, I could reach the highway. It would take hours, maybe all day, but it was my only chance. I left that morning and didn't look back. I kept the knife in hand, moving as fast as I could through the trees. Every sound made me think they were behind me. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. It was supposed to be a break from the noise and stress of my normal life, a way to slow down and breathe air that wasn't thick with car exhaust or the smell of fast food. The cabin sat deep in the woods, a place I had rented from an older man through a small online listing. It was advertised as off the grid, quiet, and far enough from town that I would not hear anything but wind and wildlife. That was the point. I wanted silence, isolation, time to clear my head. The drive took hours, most of it along cracked highways and empty rural roads. When I turned onto the gravel path that cut into the forest, I felt my phone's signal vanish. I glanced at the corner of the screen and watched the bars flicker until they were gone. The path twisted tightly between tall pines, their branches overlapping above me so much that the sunlight barely touched the hood of the car. I slowed to a crawl, gravel crunching under the tires, and followed the path until the trees parted slightly and the cabin appeared. It was small and plain, made of wood that had darkened with age. The roof sagged a little on one side, and the porch steps looked worn. But it stood solid, tucked into the trees like it had been there for decades. A clearing surrounded it, maybe half an acre of patchy grass, stumps, and rocks before the trees swallowed the land again. The stillness of the place settled over me. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment with the windows rolled down, hearing only the faint hiss of the wind through the pines and the distant call of a bird. I hauled my bags inside. The cabin smelled of dry wood and dust. It had one small main room with a stove, a counter, and a table pushed against the wall. A short hallway led to a single bedroom with a narrow bed, and there was a bathroom with a pump sink and an outhouse just beyond the back porch. It was exactly what I expected: bare, quiet, and simple. For the first few hours, I felt good. I unpacked, set up my things, and went outside to walk around the clearing. I circled the cabin a few times, noting the thick wall of forest pressing close on every side. The trees stood like a barrier, their trunks straight and tall, their bark dark against the moss and fallen needles at their base. The sky above them was pale and streaked with clouds. That first night passed quietly. I cooked a simple meal on the small stove, sat at the table, and wrote in my notebook while the light faded outside. By the time I went to bed, the woods were black and silent. I listened to the faint groans of the old cabin as it cooled in the night air, then drifted off. The next morning, I went for a short hike. I wanted to stretch my legs and see how far the forest stretched. The paths weren't marked, but there were faint trails of trampled earth and broken branches. I followed one, wandering deeper until the cabin was hidden. The forest felt endless, trunks rising like columns in every direction. I walked for nearly an hour, but the trails all seemed to circle and twist until I wasn't sure where I was. For a moment, I felt a pulse of unease in my chest. The trees looked the same in every direction, and the silence pressed in. I turned back, keeping track of landmarks: a broken stump, a leaning pine, a patch of moss, until I found the clearing again. That unease stayed with me, faint but constant. The forest was beautiful, but it was also easy to get lost in. I reminded myself to be careful, to stay close to the cabin. The second night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but when I opened my eyes, The cabin was dark and silent except for a faint scraping noise outside. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening. The sound came again, slow, rough, like something dragging across the porch steps. My heartbeat quickened. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a branch shifting in the wind, but the air outside was still. The sound stopped after a while, and I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. The wooden steps had faint marks on them, scratches that looked fresh. I crouched down, running my hand over them. They were shallow but long, running parallel as if something had been dragged. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer had wandered too close and slipped. I tried to push the thought aside. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I gathered wood from the edges of the clearing, chopped some kindling, and stacked it neatly by the porch. I cooked, read, and wrote notes in my notebook. But the whole time, I felt the weight of the trees pressing in, as if the forest was watching. Every now and then, I caught myself staring at the tree line, scanning the shadows between the trunks, half expecting to see something move. By the third night, the feeling was worse. Couldn't shake it. When darkness fell, the silence felt heavier, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried to sleep, but my ears strained for sounds. Sure enough, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Not scraping this time, but a dull thump. Then another. The sound of weight shifting on the porch. My skin prickled. I lay frozen, listening. The thumps grew softer, then stopped. In the morning, I found more marks on the porch. This time they were clearer scuffed wood, faint dirt smudges. Something heavy had been up there. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. If it had been an animal, I should have seen tracks in the dirt around the clearing. But I didn't. The ground was undisturbed except for my own footprints. I spent that day restless. I kept glancing at the tree line, scanning for movement. The silence seemed thicker than before, broken only by occasional bird calls. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. The forest was full of animals. Scratches and noises were normal. Still, the unease dug deep, impossible to shake. That night, I decided to stay awake. I sat at the table with a lantern, notebook open, listening to the cabin creak. Hours passed in silence, the lantern hissing softly. Just when I thought I might have been imagining it all, I heard it again. A step on the porch. Slow, careful. Then another. My body went rigid. I turned the lantern down until the light was barely aglow and held my breath. The steps creaked again, closer to the door. I stared at the dark outline of the doorframe, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. The sound stopped just outside. Minutes dragged by. The silence pressed so heavy it hurt my ears. Then came a faint scrape along the wall, just beneath the window, as if something brushed against the wood. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded. No more steps, no more scraping, just silence again. When dawn finally broke, I opened the door with trembling hands. The porch was marked again, but this time there was something else. On the dirt just beyond the steps, there was a footprint. Human, bare. I froze, staring at it. The print was clear, heel, arch, toes pressed into the damp soil. It was larger than my own foot, wide and long. The air rushed out of me. I wasn't alone out here, and that was only the beginning. I had rented the cabin for one reason only, to get away from everything for a while. Life back home had been piling up on me, stress stacking layer after layer until I felt I couldn't breathe right anymore. I didn't want people, I didn't want noise, I didn't want responsibilities pulling at me from every direction. What I wanted was silence, the kind of silence you can only find far from cities, where the trees surround you and the nights stretch out longer than you expect. That was what I thought I was going to get when I pulled my car up the long gravel road that led to the small cabin I had booked online. The cabin sat tucked back against the edge of dense woods, far enough from the main road that I couldn't see another house. The listing had said private, and it wasn't lying. There were no neighbors, no other cabins, not even a ranger station nearby. Just this one place, A square wooden structure with a slanted tin roof, a wraparound porch, and a single dirt driveway that ended right in front. My car crunched to a stop on the gravel, and for a long moment I just sat there, engine ticking as it cooled, listening to how quiet everything was. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The sun had dipped low enough that the trees cast long shadows across the clearing. I could hear the wind moving in the leaves, but nothing else. No voices, no cars, no distant hum of power lines. Just wind and silence. That was what I thought I wanted, and at first it felt like I had made the right choice. The cabin was small but decent. Inside there was one bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen that was more of a corner with a stove and sink, and a living area with a couch and wood stove. The air smelled faintly of pine and old wood. It looked lived in, but not by much. The furniture was plain, the kind of stuff you find in places meant for short rentals. The fridge was empty except for a few bottles of water left behind, and the cupboards held only some mismatched dishes. I had brought all my food and supplies, and as I unloaded the car, I felt a small wave of relief. I thought this was exactly what I needed. By the time I was done unpacking, the sun was sinking fast. The woods outside darkened in a way that was almost instant. It was a reminder that I was far away from any streetlights or glow from a nearby town. When night came out here, it came fully. I turned on the cabin's lights, which were weak yellow bulbs that made everything inside look warmer than it really was. I ate a simple meal, set my phone aside. There was no signal anyway, and settled into the couch with a book. The only sounds were the occasional pop of the wood stove and the faint creak of the house as it cooled. I fell asleep there before long. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The cabin was cold, and the fire in the stove had burned down to embers. I went to the window, pulling the curtain back a little, and saw nothing but black outside. My reflection was all I could see. I stood there a long time, staring into it, listening. The silence that had been comforting earlier now pressed against me. It wasn't that I heard something, it was that I didn't. No crickets, no owls, no night sounds. Just nothing. My mind picked at that for too long, but eventually I got the fire going again and crawled into bed. The first full day in the cabin went like I expected. I hiked a little on the trails behind the house, cooked some food, and sat outside for a while, listening to the trees shift with the wind. It was quiet, but in the daylight that didn't bother me. I even enjoyed it. I tried to push away the strange feeling I'd had the night before, but when night fell again, the unease returned. I couldn't explain it. The cabin was the same, the woods the same, but the silence had weight in it. I slept poorly again, waking every hour to check the window. The third night was when things began to change. I had gone to bed early, but at some point deep into the night I woke up suddenly, heart pounding for no clear reason. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, trying to figure out what had woken me. The cabin was still, but after a while I thought I heard something faint outside. Not close, but out there in the woods. A snapping sound, like a branch breaking. Then nothing. I held my breath, waiting. A minute passed, maybe more. Then another crack. Closer. I told myself it was just animals, a deer or something, moving through the brush. I forced myself to lie back down, though I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked the edge of the woods near the cabin, trying to find tracks. I didn't see much, just a few impressions in the dirt that could have been anything. Still, I told myself it was normal. This was the wilderness and animals lived here. Nothing strange about that. I went about the day reading, writing a little, eating. I tried to ignore how uneasy I had started to feel. That night, though, I couldn't ignore it. Started again the same way. A sound outside, a crunch, a step, not steady, not moving past, but stopping and starting. I froze in bed, every nerve tight. Then I heard it again on the other side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, as if something or someone was moving around, circling. My mouth went dry. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I sat awake until dawn, not daring to move. When the sky finally lightened, I got up and went outside, forcing myself to check. The ground around the cabin was soft dirt in places, and there were marks there that hadn't been before. Not animal tracks, They were too wide, too flat. Shoe prints. They circled the cabin, just like I had heard in the night. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there, walking around while I was inside alone. I'll keep going with this in full detail. It will be extremely long, more than 7,000 words, covering every moment what I did, how the nights escalated, what I discovered, how I reacted, and how it ended. I drove up the old dirt road later in the afternoon, my tires crunching over gravel that had been scattered years ago and never replaced. The woods on both sides pressed close in, dark pine and bare-limbed oak trees leaning in toward the narrow path. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I followed the road deeper, each bend revealing more forest and less sky. The sun was sinking fast, the low light cutting through the trees in sharp lines, making the shadows seem longer and heavier. I was heading toward the small cabin I had rented for the week, a place far enough from town that it felt like it stood on the edge of nowhere. That was the point of it, or at least that had been the plan. I thought I wanted silence, solitude, and time away from people. I thought I would welcome the quiet. I didn't yet understand how quiet could turn against you when there was nothing else around. The cabin came into view as the road curved once more. It sat in a small clearing, squat and weathered, its dark wood siding scarred by years of storms and winters. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. The porch boards were warped and gray, some of them bowed up enough that I knew I would trip if I didn't watch my step. A metal chimney pipe jutted from the side, stained black around the edges. It looked less like a cozy getaway and more like something someone had abandoned years ago. But the owner had told me it was functional, stocked with firewood, and had running water from a well. That was all I needed. I parked the truck off to the side, close enough that I could unload my bags without walking too far. The silence of the clearing hit me the moment I shut off the engine. The forest seemed to breathe, all rustling leaves and faint creaks. But there was no sound of cars, no voices, no distant hum of power lines. Just the woods, still and heavy around me. I stood there for a moment, my hands still on the steering wheel, staring at the cabin. Something about it made me hesitate, though I told myself it was just nerves from being so far away from everything familiar. I carried my bags inside and set them on the floor just past the door. The air was stale, the kind of smell wood takes on after sitting through years of damp seasons. Dust clung to every surface, and when I ran my hand along the small kitchen counter, it came away gray. The floor creaked under my steps. The cabin had one main room with a wood stove on the far wall, a small table pushed up near a single window, and a short hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was simple, stripped down to what was necessary. I told myself that was fine. After unpacking the basics, some clothes, food supplies, and a few books, I went back outside to check around the property before the sun dropped completely. The clearing stretched out maybe 30 yards in every direction before the trees pressed in again. The woodpile was stacked near the back wall of the cabin, covered by a tarp that flapped softly in the breeze. The well pump stood a few feet off to the side, its handle stiff but working when I tried it. The air had turned cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. I stood still, listening. The forest wasn't silent now. Somewhere far off, I heard a woodpecker hammering against a trunk. A crow cut across the sky above, its wings black against the fading light. I went back inside and locked the door, sliding the bolt in place. That was when I noticed the doorframe had marks around it. Faint scratches, not the kind from animals but straight lines, as if someone had tried to pry the lock open at some point. I crouched down to look closer. The wood had been gouged shallow but long, angled in a way that suggested a tool had been used. I told myself it was old damage, probably from years ago, and that the owner would have mentioned it if it was recent. Still, it sat in the back of my mind as I built a fire in the stove and cooked a small meal on the hot surface. By the time I finished eating, night had swallowed the clearing. The window showed nothing but blackness beyond the glass, my own reflection looking back at me when I moved. I turned on the small battery-powered lantern I had brought since the cabin didn't have electric lights. Its glow filled the room with a soft yellow, pushing the shadows back but never fully erasing them. Every sound seemed louder now, the shifting of the firewood as it burned, the groan of the cabin as it settled, even the wind sliding along the eaves. I tried to read for a while, but the words blurred as my ears strained for noises outside. At some point, I went to the bedroom and lay down on the narrow bed. The mattress was thin, the sheets scratchy, but I was too tired to care. I left the lantern burning low beside me. My eyes stayed open long after I had closed them the first time. The forest outside wasn't quiet anymore. I could hear twigs snapping, faint crunches in the underbrush. I told myself it was deer, maybe raccoons, nothing more. But when the steps paused, starting again closer to the cabin, I felt my chest tighten. I stared at the door across the room, the shadows quivering against it as the lantern flame flickered. My ears strained for every detail. After a long while, the steps faded. I told myself I imagined it, but I didn't fall asleep until the fire had burned down to cold ash and the lantern had gone out. The next morning, I woke to pale light filtering through the window. My body ached from the hard mattress. I went outside, telling myself to shake off the unease from the night. The grass was wet with dew, the clearing quiet except for birds calling from high branches. That was when I saw it. In the dirt just past the porch, near the steps, were prints. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had been there. The ground was damp enough that the impressions were clear, leading from the trees toward the cabin and then back again. I crouched and touched the edge of one. The soil crumbled soft under my finger. These weren't old. They had been made recently, maybe during the night. My chest tightened as I stood up and looked around. The woods were still, no sign of anyone watching. But the prints told me enough. Someone had been close enough to stand at my steps. Maybe they had been the ones I heard. Maybe they had been testing the lock on the door again. I tried to steady myself by telling myself the area wasn't completely empty. Maybe hunters passed through, maybe hikers. But the way the tracks stopped at the cabin and turned back made it feel different. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone approaching. I went through the rest of the day forcing myself to stay busy. I chopped some wood, carried water from the well, tried to read again. But my eyes kept drifting to the window, scanning the trees for movement. I couldn't stop replaying the sound of those steps in my head. That night, I stayed up later, lantern burning, listening harder than before. Hours stretched out slow. Sometime deep into the night, I heard it again. A faint crunch, then another. The sound of weight pressing into damp earth. My skin prickled. The steps came closer, steady, not rushing. They stopped near the side of the cabin. The boards of the wall creaked as if something brushed against them. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. I sat frozen in the chair near the table, gripping the lantern handle, every muscle tense. There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if whoever it was had gone. Then came the sound of the doorknob turning slowly, testing against the lock. The bolt held firm, but the knob jiggled faintly, the metal scraping. My throat went dry. Whoever was outside stood there, trying, silent. Then, after what felt like forever, the knob stilled. The steps moved again, fading back into the woods. I barely slept at all after that. The next morning, the prints were there again, deeper this time, circling the cabin before returning to the trees. I checked the lock, running my hand over the scratches in the frame. They seemed fresher now. I knew then that it wasn't just my imagination. Someone was coming here at night, walking circles around the cabin, testing the door. I spent the next day on edge, every sound turning my head. I tried to think of what I could do. I had no phone signal this deep in the woods. The truck was still there, but the idea of driving down that narrow dirt road at night felt worse somehow, as if I might meet whoever it was head-on. I thought about leaving in daylight, but something kept me there. Maybe stubbornness, maybe disbelief that this was actually happening. That night was the worst. The steps came again, but this time they didn't stop at the door. They moved along the wall, slow and careful. I heard the crunch of grass underfoot, then the soft creak of the porch boards. Whoever it was standing just feet away. My breath caught in my chest. I sat in the dark, lantern off this time, holding a piece of firewood in my hand like a club. The boards groaned under the weight, then stilled. Silence stretched out, heavy and crushing. When morning came, I opened the door and found the prints all over the clearing. They went from the trees to the porch, around the back, even to the woodpile. It was as if the person had circled the cabin over and over again, checking every side. I knew then that staying wasn't safe. This wasn't random. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone watching, waiting, coming closer each night. I packed my things quickly, loading them into the truck with shaking hands. I glanced at the trees one last. I never thought a trip to a small cabin in the woods could turn into something that would change the way I looked at life, at safety, and at the small details that we often ignore. When I first planned the trip, I wanted peace. I wanted to get away from the city noise, the constant phone calls, and the stress of work that had been eating me alive for months. I picked the cabin because it was cheap, far enough away from people, and close enough to a lake and some hiking trails that I thought I could relax and spend a few days clearing my head. The cabin wasn't much. It was one of those old wooden structures that looked like it had been there for decades, probably built by someone who just wanted a hunting spot away from the main road. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were small and unevenly placed. Inside, there was a small fireplace, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a creaky bed, and a small storage area that barely counted as a kitchen. The floorboards bent when I walked on them, and I could hear mice in the walls at night. But I didn't care. I wasn't there for comfort. I was there for quiet. The first day went by normally. I carried my bags inside, stacked some firewood, and took a walk around the area. The forest felt endless, thick with pine trees, their needles covering the ground like a soft carpet. The air was damp, carrying the smell of soil and bark. I walked down to the lake, which was about half a mile away. The water was still and black, with a thin fog resting on its surface. I threw a few stones across and watched the ripples spread out. I felt calm, almost too calm, like I was far away from the rest of the world. That night, the quietness felt strange. I wasn't used to hearing nothing. In the city, even at night, there's always something. A siren, a horn, a neighbor shouting. Out there, all I heard was the wind moving through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch, and the faint scratching of rodents in the cabin walls. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat when I lay in bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The second day, I decided to do more hiking. I packed some water, a few snacks, and my pocket knife, and I followed a trail that disappeared deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker the farther I went, blocking out the sun until it felt like I was walking under a green ceiling. After a few miles, I came across an old hunting blind, rotting and half collapsed. It looked like no one had used it in years. I kept moving, trying to keep track of the trail, but I realized that there were forks and side paths everywhere, and it would be easy to lose track of where I had come from. I decided to head back before I went too far. Back at the cabin, I cooked some canned food and sat outside on the porch steps, watching the trees. That was when I noticed something odd. About 50 yards into the woods, there was a tree with a deep cut in it, like someone had hacked it with an axe. It wasn't fresh, but it stood out against the smooth bark of the other trees. I figured it was just a hunter marking territory or someone cutting firewood years ago. Still, it gave me a strange feeling, like someone had been there, leaving signs behind. That night was when things started to feel different. I had just put out the lantern and lay down in bed when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a crunch of leaves, slow, steady, like someone walking. I froze in bed, straining my ears. It wasn't an animal. I had grown up hearing raccoons, deer, and stray dogs moving around in the woods near my childhood home. This was heavier, more deliberate. The steps circled the cabin slowly, pausing every few seconds, then continuing. I stayed still, barely breathing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. After what felt like an hour, the steps faded into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat up in bed, clutching the pocket knife, waiting for the noise to come back. Didn't. The next morning, I stepped outside carefully. The ground around the cabin was covered in pine needles, which made it hard to see tracks, but I thought I saw a faint impression of a boot near the firewood pile. Couldn't be sure. Maybe it was my own from the day before. Still, I felt uneasy. I told myself it was probably just a hunter or someone passing through. The woods didn't belong to me. I tried to distract myself by fishing at the lake that afternoon. I sat on a rock with a simple line, watching the water ripple. But I couldn't focus. Every sound in the woods behind me made me turn my head. Every crack of a branch made me think someone was standing there, just out of sight. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something else that made my stomach twist. The axe I had leaned against the wall near the woodpile was gone. I searched around, thinking maybe it had fallen, but it wasn't there. I hadn't used it since I arrived. It didn't make sense. That night, I barricaded the door with the table and chair. I left the lantern on, even though I knew it would burn through my fuel faster. I lay in bed, clutching the knife again, listening. Sure enough, the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't just circle once. They moved back and forth, slowly, like whoever it was pacing outside, waiting. Sometimes they stopped right by the door, and I swore I could hear breathing through the cracks. My throat was dry. My body refused to move. I sat there, frozen, praying the door would hold. It went on for hours. At some point, I must have blacked out from exhaustion because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the small window. I checked the door, and the chair and table were still in place. I stepped outside, shaking, and that was when I saw it. On the tree near the cabin, someone had carved a line. It was fresh. The wood was pale and raw compared to the bark. At that moment, I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone was out there watching me, letting me know they were close. My chest felt tight. I thought about leaving, but the nearest road was miles away, and I didn't know if I would make it without running into whoever it was. I thought about calling for help, but I had no signal on my phone. The days dragged on. I tried to stay calm during daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. I never did, but every night the footsteps came back. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. And every morning, I would find another mark on the trees. A slash, a symbol, a reminder. I started losing track of time. My food supplies were running low because I was too scared to leave the cabin for long. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. My hands shook constantly. I thought about making a run for it during the day, but the idea of being followed through the endless woods made me freeze. At least in the cabin, I had 4 walls around me. Then came the worst night. I had just managed to doze off when I woke to the sound of wood splintering. Someone was trying the door. The table rattled as pressure pushed against it. My heart stopped. I grabbed the knife, crouched by the bed, and waited. The pushing stopped after a while, but then I heard it. The sound of metal dragging across the door. My axe. They scraped it back and forth slowly, not breaking in, just letting me hear it. I sat there, frozen, as the noise went on and on. When it finally stopped, I didn't move until the sun came up. The next morning, the axe was buried in the door, its blade sunk deep into the wood. I pulled it out with shaking hands, staring at the mark it had left. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed what little I had left, stuffed the knife into my pocket, and set out toward the road. I didn't care if I got lost. I had to try. I walked fast, almost running, my eyes darting around the trees. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. My mouth was dry, my legs weak, but I kept moving. After hours of stumbling through the forest, I finally heard something. Cars, faint in the distance. I followed the sound until I stumbled out onto the gravel road. I nearly collapsed from relief. I never went back for my things. I never wanted to see that cabin again. Even now, months later, I think about it every night before I sleep. I wonder who it was out there. I wonder how long they had been watching me before I even noticed. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. All I know is this: out there in the woods, far from anyone who could help, the scariest thing isn't the silence. It's realizing you're not alone. I had been planning to spend a week alone at the cabin for months, telling myself it would be a chance to get away from work and noise and people. I wanted quiet, time to clear my head, and to just sit in the stillness of nature. The cabin belonged to a friend's uncle, and it was old but sturdy, tucked in the thick woods near a large lake. I had been there once before for only a day, but this time I planned to stay for a week. The drive up was long, winding through country roads that grew narrower the deeper I went. The last stretch was a dirt path filled with bumps and ruts, forcing me to go slow. The trees grew tall and close together, so much that sunlight barely reached the ground in some spots. The air smelled damp, full of pine and soil, and when I finally saw the cabin, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. It stood in a small clearing, its roof darkened with age, its porch sagging slightly. There was no one around for miles. I carried my bags inside and set them down. The cabin was simple. One large room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a back room with a bed. The wood floors creaked under my steps, and the air inside smelled faintly of old smoke and dust. I opened the windows to let fresh air in, then walked back out to the porch to look around. The clearing was surrounded on all sides by dense woods. There was a narrow trail leading down to the lake, but otherwise it felt cut off from the rest of the world. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, gathered wood from the pile stacked behind the cabin, and built a fire in the stove. I heated a simple meal and sat outside as the sun went down, listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets, frogs, the distant splash of something in the lake. As the light faded, the trees turned into dark walls around me. I stayed outside until it was too dark to see, then went inside and locked the door. The nights were colder than I expected. I lay in bed under heavy blankets, listening to the sounds outside. Every creak of the cabin made me pause. The woods were alive with noises I couldn't identify, branches snapping, leaves shifting. I reminded myself it was normal. Animals moving around, the wind playing tricks, but still I found it hard to sleep. By the second day, I started to notice things that unsettled me. The first was a tree near the edge of the clearing. I had walked past it the day before without paying much attention, but now I saw that its bark had been stripped away in long vertical lines. They were too high up to be from a small animal, too neat to be random. I told myself it was probably from a bear, though the thought of a bear that close to the cabin made my stomach tighten. Later, when I walked down to the lake, I found something else. In the mud near the shoreline were prints. They weren't clear enough to say for sure what they were, but they were large and deep. I crouched down to look, the damp smell of the lake filling my nose, and felt a rush of unease. I told myself again it had to be an animal. This was the woods, after all. Animals lived here. I was the intruder. Still, I walked back to the cabin faster than before, looking over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. That night, I struggled to sleep. The cabin made small popping sounds as the wood cooled, and I kept hearing something outside. Not close, but moving. Footsteps, maybe. They would come, then stop, then come again. I held my breath under the covers, listening until my heart pounded so loud I could barely hear anything else. Eventually, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. The third day, I decided to keep busy. I chopped more wood, swept out the cabin, and tried to fish at the lake. The hours passed slowly. I kept looking at the tree with the stripped bark, kept glancing at the tree lean expecting to see something there. Nothing appeared. But that evening, when I walked around the clearing one last time before going inside, I noticed something different. Near the back of the cabin, where the ground dipped slightly, there was a clear footprint in the mud. It wasn't an animal. It was a human footprint. Bare, large, deep. I froze, staring at it, feeling my chest grow tight. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it had been left a long time ago, though the edges looked fresh, not weathered by rain or wind. Maybe someone had passed through, a hunter or hiker. But who would walk barefoot this far out into the woods? And why hadn't I heard anyone? I went inside and locked the door. I checked the windows twice, pulled the curtains shut, and sat with my back against the wall, listening. The woods outside felt different now. The sounds sharper, closer. I barely slept at all that night. On the fourth day, I thought about leaving. I packed some of my things, even carried them out to the car. But then I told myself I was being paranoid. People hiked through the woods all the time. The footprint didn't mean anything. I forced myself to unpack, though unease clung to me like a shadow. That afternoon I heard it. Not the usual sounds of the forest. Not the distant crack of a branch. This was closer, heavier. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart hammered as I stood frozen in the center of the room. The steps moved past one wall, then another. They stopped. The silence pressed in around me. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. But I knew what I had heard. That night, I pushed a chair against the door. I sat up in bed with my flashlight clutched in my hand, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any sound. Around midnight, I heard something brush against the wall outside. A scrape, low and slow, like a hand dragging across the wood. My throat went dry, and I didn't move until dawn. By the fifth day, I was exhausted. My hands shook as I lit the stove. My eyes felt heavy, but I couldn't rest. I walked the clearing, looking for signs. Behind the cabin, in the dirt, I found more footprints. Not one, several. Some leading toward the woods, some leading toward the cabin. I knew then I wasn't alone. The rest of that day, I stayed inside. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, and every so often I thought I saw movement through the cracks. A shadow passing between trees, a figure standing still at the edge of the clearing. When I blinked, it was gone, but the feeling it left in me stayed. The sixth night was the worst. I woke to a sound at the window, a soft tap, then another. My stomach turned cold as I sat up, listening. The tap came again, followed by the faint squeak of fingers sliding against glass. Someone was outside, touching the window. Couldn't breathe. I sat in silence, the darkness pressing around me. Then I heard steps moving slowly across the porch. Pause at the door, the faint creak of the wood under weight. My heart slammed so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't move, didn't dare. Minutes passed. Finally, the steps moved away. I stayed frozen until morning light seeped through the curtains. On the seventh day, I left. I didn't eat, didn't even pack everything. I grabbed what I could, threw it into the car, and drove. I didn't look back. My hands were tight on the wheel, my eyes darting to the mirrors, half expecting to see someone behind me. When I reached the main road, I finally breathed. The cabin disappeared into the trees behind me, and I swore I'd never go back. But I still think about it. I think about the stripped tree, the footprints, the sound of fingers against glass. I think about how isolated that cabin was, how no one would have heard me if something had happened. I think about how close they came, whoever they were, circling me in the dark. And I think about the one thing that keeps me awake at night even now. I never saw their face. I don't know if they were alone, and I don't know how long they had been watching me before I noticed. I had been waiting for a quiet weekend for months, something that would give me a break from the constant stress of work, phones, and people. A cabin in the woods seemed like the right answer. I rented one far from town, deep enough into the forest that cell service would vanish and the only noise I'd hear would be wind through the trees and the sound of my own footsteps on dry leaves. It was supposed to be peace, nothing more. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads narrowed into gravel paths, the trees grew denser, and the sun started slipping behind them as I finally reached the turnoff marked by an old wooden sign that barely held up against the weather. My car bounced along the ruts of the road until the cabin appeared in the distance. It looked exactly like the photos online. Wooden walls, a slanted roof, a porch with 2 rocking chairs, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I parked near the edge of the clearing and unloaded my things. The air was colder than I had prepared for. A small chill rolled through my jacket as I carried my bags inside. The place smelled of dry wood and dust, like it had been sitting shut for months. The floor creaked under my steps, but it felt sturdy enough. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove, a bedroom with a simple bed, and a bathroom with running water powered by a pump outside. It wasn't luxury, but I hadn't come here for that. I came here to be away. First, everything was fine. I set my things down, unpacked food, stacked some logs near the fireplace, and checked the locks on the doors and windows out of habit. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I was alone out here, and I reminded myself that this was exactly what I wanted. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I lay in the bed listening to the sound of the trees groaning in the wind, branches scraping together, and the faint tap of something loose on the porch. It took me longer than usual to fall asleep, not because anything was wrong, but because of the silence. I was used to the background hum of cars, voices, and electricity. Out here, there was none of that, just dark, endless quiet. The next day, I went for a walk in the woods behind the cabin. The trees stretched tall and close, their branches twisting together, letting only bits of sunlight through. The ground was soft with old leaves. I wandered further than I meant to, and for a moment I turned around and didn't recognize the way back. A cold thought hit me that I could get lost out here. I stood still, breathing slowly, until I spotted the faint line of the trail I had made with my boots earlier. I followed it back until I saw the cabin again, sitting there in the clearing like a watchful thing. Back inside, I lit the fireplace and cooked a simple meal. As night fell, I noticed how quickly the temperature dropped. The air grew sharp and cold, my breath fogging inside the cabin. The wood popped and cracked in the fireplace, filling the space with warmth. I tried to relax, read a book, and ignore the creeping thought that I was completely cut off. No phone, no car nearby, no neighbor to call for help. If anything happened, I was on my own. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something that didn't sit right. I woke up in the middle of the night, no idea why, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The fire had died down, and the cabin was almost dark. That's when I heard it, faint crunching, like someone stepping on leaves outside. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe something smaller. But the steps were slow, heavy, measured, not quick or scattered like an animal's. I lay frozen, listening. The steps moved across the clearing, stopping every few moments, then starting again. They circled. I sat up quietly, trying not to make the bed creak, and strained my ears. The sound came closer to the porch, then stopped. Nothing, just silence. I waited, not daring to move. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been my mind mixing sounds in the wind. I forced myself to lie back down, though my eyes stayed open until morning. The next day, I searched outside. The ground was hard with frost, but I found what I didn't want to see. Prints. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled the cabin, stopped at the porch, then disappeared into the trees. My chest tightened as I looked at them. Someone had been walking around while I was inside. Someone had been standing close. I spent the day uneasy. Every sound in the woods felt sharper, closer. I tried to tell myself it was just a hunter passing through, maybe curious about the cabin. But the thought stuck in my head. Why circle it? Why come to the porch in the middle of the night? By the third night, I was on edge. I left the fire burning low and sat in the dark, waiting, listening. Hours passed. The wind rattled branches outside. An owl hooted in the distance, and then I heard it again. Slow crunching, closer this time. My skin prickled as I sat frozen in the chair. The sound came right up to the porch. Wood creaked under weight. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside the door. I held my breath. The door rattled lightly, as if a hand tested the handle. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would echo in the room. I stared at the door, every muscle in me tight, ready. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The steps moved away, slow again, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep. I sat there until the first light broke through the windows, gripping the edge of the chair. When I finally opened the door, I saw the prints again. Fresh, clear. Whoever it was had tried the handle. The rest of the day, I kept busy stacking firewood, checking every window, and trying to decide if I should leave early. But my car was low on gas, and the nearest station was nearly an hour away. I told myself I'd wait one more night, then go in the morning. That night was the worst. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion caught me. I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of glass. My eyes shot open, and I realized one of the windows had been touched. A faint creak followed. I grabbed the small hatchet I had used for firewood and stood in the dark, barely breathing. The sound of footsteps moved inside the porch. The handle turned again, more forceful this time, rattling. My chest burned as I held still. Then silence. Minutes passed, then the crunch of steps moving away again. I waited until morning before stepping outside. The prints were everywhere, around the porch, circling, stopping at windows. Whoever it was hadn't given up. I packed my bags as fast as I could, shoved everything into the car, and started the engine. The gas light was on, but I didn't care. I drove fast down the narrow road, the cabin shrinking behind me. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat there shaking. I looked back once, down the path I had come from, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just trees. I never went back to that cabin. I reported what happened, but nothing came of it. No one found footprints, no reports of strangers in the area. It still runs through my head sometimes. Who it was, why they circled, why they came night after night, and what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door. I remind myself now that peace and silence are not always safe. Sometimes the quiet hides things you don't want to hear, and sometimes being alone is the most dangerous thing of all. I had been planning a short break for months. Life in the city had worn me down, and I needed silence, isolation, and the kind of emptiness you only find deep in the woods. I rented a small cabin that I found online. It was listed as simple, no modern luxuries, just 4 walls, a roof, a wood stove, and a small porch overlooking a clearing. The man who rented it out told me it had no neighbors for miles. That was what drew me in. I thought a weekend away from noise, from people, from everything, would give me the reset I needed. The drive out there was long. The road got narrower the farther I went, eventually turning into gravel, then dirt. Trees closed in around me, the type that blocked most of the sunlight when you looked up. There were moments when I wondered if I had gone too far or missed a turn. But finally, after bouncing along the uneven track for nearly half an hour, the cabin appeared in front of me. It sat in a clearing, the wood weathered, the windows small and square. The roof sagged a little at the corners, but it looked sturdy enough. There was a chopping block off to the side with a few logs split and ready. When I stepped out of the car, the silence hit me. No cars, no people, no hum of machines. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the far-off sound of a bird. It felt strange at first, almost like the world had gone empty, but I liked it. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and walked inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood, but it wasn't unpleasant. There was a bed against one wall, a small table, a chair, and a stove with a stack of firewood beside it. A lantern sat on the table. It was exactly as simple as promised. The first day passed easily. I walked around the clearing, stretched my legs after the long drive, and explored a little path that led into the woods behind the cabin. It was quiet, peaceful, and a little unnerving. I had brought food, a book, and a notebook. I thought I would spend most of my time reading and writing. That night, I lit the lantern, warmed up a can of soup on the stove, and sat at the table. The quiet pressed in, thicker at night, but I reminded myself this was what I came for. The first strange thing happened late that night. I was lying in bed, the lantern out, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. It was so dark that I couldn't see the walls of the cabin. I had almost drifted off when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like a branch breaking under weight, then another. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the clearing. But then it sounded closer, heavier, like footsteps. Slow, steady, moving past the cabin. My body froze. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped after a while, and the silence returned. I told myself it was probably just a large animal. I had read about moose and bears in the area, but the weight of the steps had felt measured, deliberate. It took me a long time to fall asleep after that. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. The grass and dirt around the clearing were disturbed, but not in a clear way. There were faint marks, maybe footprints, maybe just the ground pressed by an animal. It was hard to tell. I didn't linger on it. I went about my day, hiked a little further along the trail, sat by the fire pit outside the cabin, and read. That night, it happened again. I was sitting on the porch just before bed, looking at the treeline. The woods were black, shadows shifting in the wind. Then I heard it, crunch, crunch, slow and steady, moving just out of sight. My chest tightened. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting. The sound stopped again, and I didn't see anything. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on the bed in the dark. Hours later, I woke up to another sound, something brushing against the wall of the cabin. A soft scrape, then silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I sat up in bed, staring into the dark, listening. It came again, this time on the other side of the wall, lower, as if someone's hand had dragged along the wood. Then nothing. When morning came, I went outside again. The dirt near the back wall had been disturbed. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footprints. Human. The shape was clear. I can't explain the way my stomach dropped when I saw them. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had walked right up to the cabin during the night, close enough to touch it. The prints led from the treeline to the wall and then back again. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, my mouth dry, my skin prickling. I thought about leaving. I had my car and the road wasn't far. But the more I thought about it, the more I told myself maybe it was nothing. Maybe some hiker had wandered too close. Maybe someone was just curious. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe I wasn't alone out here with someone watching me. But the next night shattered that thought. I had locked the door, checked it twice, and pulled the curtains shut. I lay in bed, lantern out, forcing myself to keep calm. At some point in the night, I woke to a noise that was different from before. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of the door handle rattling. Slow, soft, like someone testing it. My whole body went rigid. The handle moved again, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I sat there in the dark, gripping the edge of the mattress, every muscle in my body tense. I waited for a knock, a break, something. Nothing came. After what felt like an hour, I heard footsteps moving away, fading into the woods. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag, threw everything in the car, and was ready to leave. But as I reached for the driver's door, I froze. Stuck under the wiper on my windshield was a piece of paper. It was folded, damp with morning dew. My hands shook as I opened it. Scrawled in uneven handwriting were 4 words. "You shouldn't be here." I dropped it, my stomach twisting, my vision blurring for a moment. I looked around the clearing, the treeline, the cabin. Everything was still and quiet, but I knew whoever had been out there had gotten close enough to leave that note. Close enough to stand right by my car while I slept inside the cabin. I didn't waste another second. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove. The dirt road felt longer this time, the trees pressing in on both sides, every shadow looking like a figure. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, and even then, I didn't breathe easy until I was miles away. When I finally got back to town, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to steady myself. My hands were stiff from gripping the wheel so hard. My chest ached from how long I had been holding my breath. I thought about reporting it, but what would I say? Some stranger left footprints and a note. No one had harmed me, no one had been caught. It would go nowhere. That night, back in my own bed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the apartment made me jump. Every sound outside the window made me freeze. The woods had been quiet, but not empty. Someone was out there watching. Someone who wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. And the worst part was knowing that they had probably been closer than I realized. Not just in the clearing, not just at the wall, but maybe right outside the window while I slept. maybe watching me longer than I ever knew. I never went back to that cabin. I never even drove near those woods again. And to this day, I can't sit in silence without hearing the crunch of footsteps moving slowly, steadily, just beyond the edge of the light. I drove up into the mountains that morning with the thought that I would finally get a break from everything. The city had been weighing me down. I was tired of the noise, the endless traffic, the constant feeling that I had no space of my own. A friend of mine had once told me about an old cabin he used a couple of years back, not too far from the main road but far enough into the woods to feel isolated. He gave me vague directions and told me it was simple but decent, with the kind of rough charm you could only find in a place that had been left behind by time. I liked the sound of that. I packed my truck the night before with food, water, tools, and extra clothes. I had no real plan other than to sit by a fire, read, and sleep without hearing another person for a few days. The road up into the mountains started paved, then narrowed, then turned into gravel. I had to slow down to keep the truck steady. The trees thickened, and the canopy over the road got darker the deeper I drove. After a while, I stopped seeing houses. Then I stopped seeing signs. I pulled out the notes I had written from my friend's description, but the landmarks he had mentioned were vague. A big split tree, a rusted gate that no longer closed, an old trail marker with the paint peeling off. I found the tree, then the gate, and after another 10 minutes of slow driving, I saw the trail marker. The gravel road bent left and then ended in a small clearing. The cabin sat there at the far edge, quiet and still, almost hidden by tall pines around it. The cabin wasn't big. One story with walls weathered gray, a small porch with 2 broken steps, and a roof that sagged a little on one side. There was a single window in front and another along the side. The chimney leaned slightly but still looked solid. I cut the engine and sat for a minute, just listening. The air was still. I couldn't hear any cars, no voices, not even the faint hum of power lines. The silence was so complete it felt heavy. I got out, stretched, and walked up the short path to the porch. The wood creaked under my boots. The door was unlocked, just like my friend said it would be. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry wood, dust, and faint mildew. The air was cool. There was one main room with a wood stove, a small table, 2 chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The bed had a thin mattress, a folded blanket, and nothing else. The floorboards were uneven, worn smooth from years of use. Against the back wall was a counter with a small sink that looked like it hadn't carried water in years. I set down my bag and walked the place slowly, checking everything. No electricity, no running water. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Old, simple, and quiet. It felt like the kind of place where you could sit for hours with only the crackling of the stove to remind you time was moving. I spent that first afternoon sweeping the floor, airing the place out, and stacking the wood I had brought. I checked the woodpile outside and found it half rotted, but there was still enough dry wood underneath for a few fires. I hauled it in, lined it up, and made the room look a little more lived in. By evening, I had a small fire going in the stove. The flames warmed the air, and the smell of burning pine filled the cabin. I sat by the stove, ate a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat, and felt a rare kind of peace. When the light faded outside, the woods went black fast. I didn't bother lighting more than one lantern. I crawled into bed early, listening to the crackle of the fire until I fell asleep. The first night was calm. I woke a few times to the sound of wind in the trees, and once to the sharp crack of a branch falling somewhere outside. Each time I lay still, listening, reminding myself that the woods made noises like that all the time. Still, the silence that followed was so deep it pressed against my ears. When morning came, I stepped outside into the cold air and felt relieved to see sunlight cutting through the trees. I spent the day walking the area around the cabin. I followed the gravel road back for a while, then turned into a faint trail that led deeper into the woods. I carried a small pack with water and a knife just in case. The woods stretched in every direction, tall trees and thick brush that seemed endless. I didn't see another soul, not even the trace of someone passing through. No boot prints, no trash, Nothing. It was as if no one had been here in years. When I got back to the cabin, I chopped more wood, tidied the place, and cooked a small meal on the stove. It felt good to work, to move slowly through the day without rushing anywhere. That second night, I had more trouble sleeping. It wasn't that I heard anything unusual at first. It was more the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. The woods were quiet, yes, but too quiet. I thought maybe it was my city nerves used to constant sound. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, sure that something had touched the outside wall of the cabin. It was a dull thump, faint but enough to make my eyes snap open. I lay in bed, holding my breath, waiting. Nothing followed. I told myself it could have been a branch falling, or maybe a raccoon climbing along the wall. I forced myself to stay still until I drifted back to sleep. The third day, I tried to shake it off. I walked farther, pushing deeper into the trees. I carried a compass and marked trees as I went, careful not to lose my way. At one point, I thought I saw something between the trees ahead, just a flash of movement. But when I stopped and stared, there was nothing. I stayed still for a long time, waiting, listening. All I heard was the wind. Eventually, I moved on, though slower, more careful with each step. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was already setting. I built a bigger fire that night, more for comfort than warmth, and kept the lantern burning longer. I told myself there was nothing out there, just woods, just animals, but I couldn't shake the thought of that thump on the wall. That night, I woke again. This time, it wasn't a thump. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, crunching over leaves and twigs just beyond the cabin. My whole body went rigid. I held my breath and strained to hear. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I waited, barely blinking, for what felt like forever. Eventually, I heard nothing more. I didn't move until daylight began to show faintly through the window. The fourth day, I considered leaving. The thought of packing up and driving back to the city seemed reasonable. But then I thought of how far I had come, how much I wanted the quiet, and how maybe I was just scaring myself. I forced myself to stay. I spent the day busy, chopping more wood, fixing a loose board on the porch, and walking only short distances into the woods. I noticed something then that made my stomach tighten. About 20 yards from the cabin, near a cluster of trees, there were boot prints in the dirt. Fresh, not old. They were not mine. They were too large, spaced farther apart. Someone had been walking there recently. I crouched over them, staring, and felt a wave of unease crawl up my neck. I didn't follow them. I turned and went back inside. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me tense. The fire in the stove burned low, and I sat up on the bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing came, but I kept hearing faint noises outside, as if someone was out there, just far enough to stay hidden. The crunch of leaves, a branch snapping, once a long, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. My hands shook as I held the lantern higher, casting light across the room. The walls felt too thin, the door too weak. I sat like that until dawn. By the fifth day, I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag, gathered my food, and loaded everything back into the truck. The woods felt wrong now. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, watchful. As I slammed the truck door shut, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Not clear enough to know what it was, but enough to know someone was there. I didn't wait. I started the engine, turned the truck hard, and drove fast down the gravel road, stones kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main road miles later. When I finally pulled over, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I sat there, breathing hard, staring back at the empty road behind me. I thought of the footsteps, the prints, the noises at night. I realized I had been watched the entire time. Someone had been out there, circling the cabin, waiting, and I had almost convinced myself it was nothing. I didn't go back. I never will.